content with replying, "Nobody will do anything about it." Growing your weed with no negative impact on your surroundings sounds rightful and considerate. Lining your pockets at the expense of my quality of life amounts to stealing my fresh air. I plan on taking it back.
Thank you, Tom.
It's a tough act to follow. My name is Mary Alice Riddy, and I'm a Grass Valley resident. I am in Dan Miller's district. And as I told Dan, I am an advocate for a responsible and discreet cannabis industry in Nevada County. I feel for the people that, have to put up with unregulated cannabis grows throughout the county. What we want to do is we want to regulate it. We want it to be zoned properly. We want to get rid of these issues. Everybody should be able to go outside. That's ridiculous. So I hear this over and over again about the smell, and yet I drive around, and once in a while I'll smell marijuana on Alta Street, different places in residential neighborhoods. And I've often said, wow, I wish somebody would call me. I'd love to come out and experience what you experience. What I'm trying to propose is that we can all work together in this county to come up with some regulations that make us all happy. Now, making us all happy is kind of difficult because I think everybody's going to be a little bit unhappy because that's just the way life is. But I think we could work together and do this. I respect the people that have issues with it. Bring your issues to the table. We can resolve this. The Cannabis Alliance tries to provide solutions, and we want to be responsible contributors to the community. And we're willing to do that. There's so many people that are willing to do that. The regulations will take care of a lot of the problems. And join us in this battle to do a good job. I welcome the opposition to help us do this. We need them. We want this industry in our county. We want to provide jobs, and we want some peace. And we want an enjoyable community. That's the goal I'm fighting for. And I'm fighting for the young people of California that need employment. They need a secondary economy, a third economy, a fourth economy. We're a state of 39 million people. I have 4 children. I watch them struggle. They're 30 to 38, all college educated. It's not the same world it was when I was young. We need to do something to help them. Thank you.
Thank you. Keep in mind, if you've heard these things before, maybe you don't need to say it again, okay? We're trying to limit this, and I appreciate your patience on this, too. Forrest? Oh, no, I'm sorry.
I'm Sonia Sokolow. I live on Oxbow Way in Golden Oaks on a 20.4-acre ranch. 2 years ago, I applied to the county to be allowed to grow medical marijuana in my permitted ag building. Last year, I grew it. I do believe in using marijuana to help for medical reasons, and I see no problem in allowing marijuana to be a recreational drug. I recently sold my ranch in Santa Cruz and invested all the proceeds from that sale here, and one of the investments was at Lake of the Pines Ranchos, a 5.84-acre property, which I intend to take my livestock to graze seasonally, but I am not going to live there. I already live in Golden Oaks. I noticed on Sunday a letter online that said the following: Dear Board of Supervisors, please add our name to the list of Lake of the Pines Ranchos residents who oppose allowing large commercial marijuana growing in our neighborhood. It has come to our attention that a property on Table Meadow Road directly next to us is currently cleaning land for that purpose. We have 4 children that would be directly affected by this. I am one of many who will be happy to contribute to lawyers' fees to ensure the safety of our neighborhood. I have full confidence that our voice in Lake of the Pines Ranchos will not be silenced. We have a strong communication system and believe in our neighborhood. Our neighborhood has a diverse community of differing ideas and values, but we all come together in agreement on this issue. I sent a letter to Sean Powers by email at the end of the day on Sunday, hoping that I could get my letter in response to this letter published, and I don't know if it did get put into the list of letters. My letter said the following: a letter by the Smith family was sent to the Board of Supervisors, and a code compliance complaint was made to Nevada County. This contiguous neighbor to my recently purchased Table Meadow property was sent without any attempt of the Smith family to communicate in a neighborly fashion with the subject property owner, Sonia Sokolow, me. I am Sonia Sokolow. I moved here to Grass Valley and Auburn area with my livestock last year. I was hoping to find neighborly people who had similar passions to mine and would not be in a rush. Everybody in Santa Cruz County is in a rush, which is why I sold my ranch there. The Smith family did not follow the U.S. Constitution. They did not grant me private property rights nor due process when they complained to Nevada County that I was grading without a permit. I am not grading at all. I was cleaning up a very abused property, abused by the prior owner. I wanted to make my property presentable and in keeping with other properties in the community. I will use my property within the laws. Now,
Sonia,
instead of
Sonia, please wrap it up, okay? Your
Yep,
time is
now
up.
instead
And
of
we did
planting-
get your letter, Sonia.
Did it get into
Yes,
the
it's part of the
packet?
record. It's
Okay, I have
part of
one
the
more
records.
sentence.
Yeah.
Now, instead of planting my intended winter crop of oat hay, followed by a spring crop of timothy or fescue hay, I will reconsider planting any other legal agricultural product I can choose to plant on my own private property. And it will be legal based on what is happening in the state and in this Nevada County. I have a PhD from Stanford.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you.
Can I present
Your
myself?
time is up. Your time is up. Forrest?
Supervisors, thank you. And good luck today with this challenging conversation. I just wanted to add a few things, hopefully constructive requests. I want to request today that while you discuss cannabis and where it is and is not allowed, that we clearly differentiate between commercial, personal use, or non-remunerative cultivation. It's very easy, we've seen in a lot of public discussions, to blend those two. So when someone's advocating for what they do or don't want in certain neighborhoods, we tend to think of the worst case scenarios or large commercial businesses, but swept into when we do not, what we do and don't allow are personal use, which is maximum 6 plants by the state, and non-remunerative growth. So I would just request that when we're talking about what we will and will not allow, that we clarify which we're speaking about, or clarify that we're not differentiating between the two. I'd also make a request that as we look at parcel sizes, that we, and what will and will not be allowed on those areas, that we take into account that for every parcel that we prohibit, it forces more people to have to look for external ways to get supply to medicine. So if we're not allowing adult use, even 6 plants, in large parts of residential areas, those are thousands of people who are going to be looking to other areas. And with the way the law works, the really only other option they have is the small 26033 non-remunerative grow that allows for up to 5 patients. This year, technically, collectives are allowed, but they sunset at the end of the year, so we're looking at what the permanent law is likely to be. So when I would ask that you take that into account, that as you look at the areas where we are prohibiting activity, we try to balance that out, and how are we going to make sure that that population has some sort of legal option. I don't need to reiterate that for everybody, growing cannabis isn't a choice. Some of us are here because we have no other choice. So if there is no legal access or legal option, due to being heavy-handed in protecting, neighborhoods, or not differentiating between commercial and personal use, then we force more people to participate in activity that isn't legal because they don't have a choice. And that's something that I hope that we think about as we make those decisions. With the non-remuneration cultivation, I would like to encourage some sort of from seed to donation tracking type system to really prohibit fraud. And set up standards that really inhibit people who want to just exploit that for personal black market activity. And the last thing I'd want to say that as a citizen, I have a lot of concern about BHO labs and in-houses, and I just want to reiterate that banning or not allowing it doesn't make problems go away. A lot of the activities that are already a problem aren't allowed. So in not allowing, say, volatile manufacturing, things like that, all we're really doing is prohibiting educated, professional, legal people to come in and give these people in their houses a legal option. So I'd appreciate if you take those things into account. Good luck today.
Thank you, Forrest.
Good afternoon, Board. Mark Johnson. I'm a medical cannabis patient. I'm also a stage 3 squamous throat cancer survivor. I use topicals, high in CBDs, low in THC, tinctures. They do not get me high, but they improve my quality of life immensely. After 6 weeks of hospitalization for chemotherapy and 48 continuous radiation treatments, I weighed 106 pounds with no will to live. But being that I have compassionate friends here in Nevada County, they supplied me with medicinal cannabis, which helped immensely. In many ways, you too may need medicinal cannabis in the future. And the fact of the matter is that Measure W, which is why we are here today, would have banned all outdoor cannabis cultivation and all commercial cannabis activities. It was defeated by an overwhelming margin of Nevada County voters. The margin was 59 to 41%, I believe. Nearly 60% of the voters say they deserve to be able to, by virtue of the democratic process, the right to grow cannabis outdoors on their own property and to see cannabis regulated in a lawful commercial market. 6 out of 10 are in favor of personal outdoor grows and commercial regulation. Only 4 in 10 are against outdoor grows. The vote proves this fact. Nearly 60% of voters, a simple majority, voted for freedom, not for setbacks. Freedom, not for denial of owners' rights. Freedom, not a de facto ban on all outdoor cannabis cultivation with the existing setbacks. Freedom, they voted to grow their 6 plants for themselves at the house, outdoors as God intended. Nearly 60% of voters, a large difference of only 40% of voters, have stated by way of the most cherished and valued democratic process that they favor outdoor cannabis cultivation and regulation. They are the victors. The 60% of voters who voted against tyranny and repression are the majority who demand their vote to be respected and honored. The 40% of voters who voted in favor of repression and prohibition are the losers. The U.S. Constitution declares their votes and their voices, must be marginalized. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Mark.
Hi, I'm Sarah Grew. I live on Pasquale Road in Nevada City. I'm also a business owner of the Ridge Cafe up in North San Juan. A couple thoughts for discussion that I wanted to present to the board is the idea of inclusionary and exclusionary zones. So, you know, you've got your zoning and your parcel size and potentially setbacks, but you can also draw a line on a map and just say, yes here, no here. And I want to present that to your discussion as well, as that's a means used in other industries and other forms of regulation. Because setbacks is a really tricky thing. I mean, it's especially when we're talking about smell. I don't know what difference 10 feet, 50 feet, and 100 feet make when the breeze is going east for hours at the time, you know. So that's a tough one. And like the more people that we can fit into this regulated system, the better, because then they are going to be held to these standards and held to the rules, held to paying taxes. And the more people that we keep out of it, it encourages the black market, and we've seen that erupt in this county over the last decades, really. And I'm just excited to see this transition for cultivators to really come out in the open and move forward into a legal market. I grew up on a dairy farm in the Midwest in the 80s, and I saw industrial ag put my neighbors out of business, and really the end of the small farmer. And I feel like the small cannabis farmer of Northern California is kind of the last of the American independent farmer, and I would really hate to see that be a thing of the past. We really have an opportunity to preserve a way of life and to preserve our rural communities of Northern California. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And we're kind of getting to the end of that time, so hopefully you may be
Good afternoon. My name is Irv Mazer, and I live at the Ranchos at Lake of the Pines. I have a question to start off. How would you all like to have a commercial marijuana business in your neighborhood? I don't think you would. We have 179 homes. We have many children in the neighborhood. We have a high school in the neighborhood. I'm sure you are aware of the smell of marijuana. I'm not against marijuana. As a matter of fact, I shouldn't say it, but I will say it. I've been smoking since I'm 16 years old. So I'm not against it. But what I am against is having a commercial marijuana business in our residential neighborhood. I don't believe commercial marijuana growth should be in any residential neighborhood, not just ours, any of them, especially where there's children, where there's a high school, where there's churches. To me, it does not bring in the best developments, number one. It brings in a lot of traffic, number two. It brings in a heavy smell. Again, I'm not opposed to marijuana, but I think if you're going to have a commercial growth, have it far away from a residential neighborhood. That's all I have to say. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Herb. All right, last one, if I can get away with it.
Hi, my name's Itera. I live in Grass Valley, and I've attended many of these meetings, and I just have one suggestion about the setbacks that I think that this needs to be figured out individually, because you can just, one size just does not fit all based on the different sizes of properties and the different problems that people have. Some people have no problem, no neighbors, and it's just an arbitrary number that we're going to try to make up that's not going to work for everybody. So I don't think there's going to be that many people that, let's say you had 3,000 growers or 10,000 growers. We have computers, and this can be done individually so that you know how much of a setback that particular property needs to make everybody happy. That's my suggestion.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you for your patience. I promise you, you will have opportunities to be speaking in front of us again. So at this time, what I'd like to do is close the public portion, comment portion, turn it back to Sean, and we will basically start getting to the meat of this issue. Sean?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Somebody told me they were having problems hearing me. Is everybody hearing me okay from earlier? Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit over a cold. Just to kind of reflect back to some of the decision points we recalled earlier, this is kind of the game plan. Obviously, the board has the discretion to change this up. Some of those decision points we'll be asking you are sort of fill in the blank for that. We can reskin those different ways as we go through the conversation. Some of them actually are yes, no questions. We did provide with the presentation a zoning reference sheet. This is a snippet out of the zoning code to give you a little bit of information on really what does an R1 and R2 and R3 and et cetera means. It was not all of the zoning designations, but we think they are the most relevant ones to the conversation. Here's kind of a batting order of some of the questions that we're going to tackle, starting with personal, going into commercial, non-remuneration, residential transition. We might not get to all of it. That's okay. We definitely want to maximize the time for the board. And again, still your preference if there's anything else we want to add in that conversation if we get through all that. So with that, I think we'll dive right into personal cultivation. So just a reminder, with the proper passage of Prop 64, the state says everybody gets their indoor plants of up to 6 plants. That is included in the Prop 64 regulations. So with that, Mr. Chairman, we thought a good place to start is when we start talking about personal outdoor cultivation, what would be the maximum number of plants that would be allowed, and then we'll drill down to some of those lower layers in there. But if we did start out with just what would be the tipping point between personal and commercial, I would turn that back over to your board.
Anyone want to start it? Six.
Mr. Chairman, I heard you say that was a 6, if I heard you correctly. So
I said 6, just to get it started.
just get it started. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like some input from your colleagues.
So would I, Sean.
I'm working on getting my notes in front of me.
So Sean, apologies, I was actually doing some mathematics up here while you were giving us instruction. What's the question you're asking me again? All of us? I apologize.
Again, we are trying to simplify at a high level. There has definitely been a lot of discussion in the process of if you are going to allow, let's say, outdoor cultivation, at a certain point, maybe that becomes more of a business than personal. So the state in its infinite wisdom decided that 6 plants indoors is kind of a threshold for personal. But when you go outdoors, the state defers that to the local jurisdiction. If you're going to allow personal, there would have to be, we would recommend a limit on the number of plants that would be. So that's the direction we're looking for with this particular decision point question.
Okay, well, first I'm going to toss an issue back at you, which is that I'm not at all clear, have not been at all clear even through the CAG process, as to the level of impact that can be anticipated from grow sizes. For example, one of the concerns I've long had, or questions I've long had, is if I can find my notes like Heidi, what's the number of plants that will create a noticeable odor for neighboring homes that have grown on 3 acres, 5 acres, and 10 acres? Do we have any clue in terms of how many plants can be grown outdoors without having a noticeable impact on neighbors within those for those 3 acreage sizes?
Unfortunately, that is a very arbitrary number because odor is definitely the most prominent concern that we hear. Obviously, as the plant count goes up, there is a correlation between the amount of odor. Obviously, the bigger parcel and potentially setback might diminish the odor, but as a few of the public comments that we actually heard, what is offensive to one person versus another is very arbitrary. So this is a difficult one to nail down.
Well, I'm not looking at it in terms of how one defines offensive. I'm just looking at the issue of odor itself. And I'll back up and note that for aviaries, we have a policy which states that there will be no odor impact or other impacts from aviaries on neighboring parcels. It seems to me that a policy like that for cannabis is appropriate also. So just add that to your to the list of things you're thinking about. But for me, those are, I mean, the acreage sizes of 3, 5, and 10 are sort of dividing points for state licenses, and to be able to understand what the actual impacts might be from the sorts of grows that are allowed under the state licensing system, I think is actually pretty important. When the state allows 50 plants on 5 acres, what does that mean for neighboring residences? And I have to believe that that 50 plants on 5 acres will likely lead to an odor impact. So that's something I'm concerned about. With regard to personal use, I take a somewhat different tack than I suspect some of my colleagues in that, 2 plants, I mean, first of all, all of us, I presume, agree that 6 plants indoors per Prop 64 is legal and allowable, and we likely have no issue regarding that. But having some plants being grown outdoors to me seems reasonable also. So I would argue that for parcel sizes of up to 1 acre, allow 2 plants outdoors. Just place them closer to the house than to the property line, and place them so that they're not visible from public land like a road or a trail or a school. Am I getting to the sorts of things you want to hear with regard to direction or advice or?
Yes, Supervisor Anderson, except the way we're actually framing it, we had to pick a place to start the conversation. Your comments are actually drilling down a little bit further. I think we can start the plant count and maybe refine it as we go through the subsequent questions on the bullet points, because when you kind of put the whole package together, that really, I think, addresses how you deal with those mitigation and neighbor impacts that you're discussing. But this was just a place to start the conversation. So,
well, the thing is that for me, for personal outdoor cultivation of up to blank plants, I mean, I can see allowing certainly 6 plants within a certain zone size or a certain parcel size. But what that parcel size is, I don't quite know yet. So I'm looking for advice or thoughts from my colleagues also. But I'm not entirely sure. But we've, in the past, there's been discussion, I think, at the CAG about disallowing all outdoor growing on all residential parcels or all parcels under a certain size. I'll be an outlier and say that, maybe allowing 2 plants, and I heard one of the CAG members, raise this point, maybe allowing a couple of plants on res parcels wouldn't have a dramatic impact on the neighbors. So I'll launch that balloon and see what happens.
Sure.
So the thing that is making this a difficult question is that state law already allows 6 plants indoors for personal use. So are we going to look at 6 plants indoors and then additional 6 plants outdoors? So which way are we going on this, Sean?
If you allowed personal cultivation outdoors, that would be in addition, because the state law allows the 6 plants indoors. So this would be additional plants to the outside.
Okay, my answer would be 0 then. If you're going to have 6 plants indoors for personal use, then there's no reason to have anything outdoors.
Okay.
If you don't, and now I'll get the mumbling, I understand. We expected the mumbling. If you do not grow indoors, but would rather grow outdoors, then we're going to be talking about zoning. And that's going to, you almost should have asked us the zoning question first.
We can jump over to the zoning question if that's the board's desire. Definitely getting through these kinds of does frame up that policy direction that we're hitting, but if you think it's more prudent to start with zoning, I'm very happy to move the conversation there.
Chair, if I may. It seems to me that what most people are looking at or asking about is the ability to begin a licensing process working with the state, which means the priority seems to be not so much the personal use. Somebody wants to grow 2 or 3 plants is not really the priority. The priority is, are we going to allow commercial grows? And if we're going to allow commercial grows, where are they going to be? And if we can answer those questions and get that process started, then we can come back down to the personal use and the much smaller numbers that would be.
That is all correct, Chairman. We've actually thought personal grows might be a good warm-up exercise to the commercial discussion. And you can see how well that went.
Yeah. I don't know how my colleagues feel. I mean, I feel like the licensing procedure is the big question here.
Let's focus.
I guess I'll jump in. And you've thrown out a whole bunch of ideas now. So let me go backwards. I think looking at a licensing procedure that we can institute very soon so that growers can apply to the state license whereby their water use and pesticides will be regulated is also critical. And I'd like to see us put that into an ordinance soon. That's my opinion. I agree that they've noted that's a priority. That's one way to get a handle on all the issues we're concerned about. So I would love to see that move forward. I'll jump in on the personal use. I think we start with what the state allows, 6 plants indoors. I would like to see allowing outdoor growth. So I'll start at the other end, which is including RA 1 acre and more. And I think on R1, R2, and actually, I think it's R2 and R3, they should not be allowed, and on R1, open to discussion. I think the issue of odor becomes an issue there. I think what we need to do here is allow as much reasonable personal use as we possibly can without impacting neighbors. And that comes especially with R1, R2, and R3. When we get to the RA discussion, I just want to note that there is substantial information in the general plan about what RA includes, and it includes agriculture. So I do want us to talk about the fact that we want to be looking at allowing grows on RA zone properties, but we should be looking at size, again, to protect neighbors. So let me throw those 3 ideas out there to start.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, so I'm hearing sort of a range of numbers, maybe between 0 to 6 so far, and to maybe make a little bit of progress on this, maybe the R2, R3 discussion as far as just trait zoning might be an easier one to start with as far as any outdoor cultivation. So if we could maybe talk specifically about R2, R3 zones.
In my mind, that was one of the issues that the CAG felt very strongly about, that there would be no grows in R2 and R3.
Yep. Personally, I feel there should be no outdoor cultivation in the neighborhoods. That includes R1, R2, R3, residential ag, and residential estate. Now, we've got the thing that in the RA zoning is we've got different parcel sizes that, because they're not all the same. And matter of fact, Molly ran us off a pretty good rundown of what we have in the county. My complaints that I'm receiving in District 3 are coming out of RA zone properties of 1.5 to 5 acres. And in our interim ordinance, they're prohibited. So obviously, our interim ordinance didn't mean anything to anyone. But to grow outdoors in RA and R1 should be prohibited. You've got to protect the neighborhoods, health and safety, and that is not, it's not being neighborly. I mean, people are growing up to 10, 15 plants in small RA parcels, and that's just not okay, because then the neighborhood suffers. And so I would say prohibit any outdoor grows in R1, 2, 3, residential ag. And residential ag, the description is it's a residential designation. Look on the general plan. It is a residential designation with a sub usage of ag. And so that's the distinction there. They aren't equal. Residential and ag and RA are not equal.
If I may, Chairman?
Yes,
Yeah, Dan, I'd actually be interested in the citation for that, because I've heard that argument and I haven't found it myself. So I'd like to look at that. But I also want to point out that the general plan on page 171 distinguishes community regions and rural regions. And in the rural regions, agriculture is encouraged. And RA is included in the rural regions. And in fact, anything abutting a community region is included in rural regions.
Now, that's a different designation, though, and what Sean gave us explains it pretty clearly as to the designations here, Heidi. So,
right, but I'm going to
rural is different, and Hank and I talked about rural is different than the RA.
I'm going directly to the document. I understand what we've got here from Sean, and I don't want to get lost in, I mean, the issue for me is if we don't like the way the zoning works, then we need to look at the zoning. But according to the general plan, RA is agricultural. I'm fine with being careful about what goes in RA, especially in terms of size. But I don't want us to get lost in, a blanket statement that we can't put anything in RA designation.
Well, no, I didn't say that. I said there's different parcel size, and
Yeah.
it's another issue we're going to have to discuss.
Yeah, that's great.
Mr. Chairman,
if I may.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, I think the RA is definitely its own healthy discussion, maybe for the purposes, maybe sticking to just R1, R2, R3, and hearing from your colleagues might be the way to maybe get through a portion of that and maybe come back to the RA.
I think 2, 3 is pretty well established.
Okay. Do we have consensus for at least R2 and R3 would be not allowed?
Why don't you ask for nodding of heads?
R1,
Outdoors.
R2, R3.
R1, R2, R3. Thank you. I guess with that, we would bring it back to an RA discussion.
Chair, may I make a clarification? The rural agricultural zoning designation can be found in the estates, the residential, and the rural general plan designations. It's a different beast. When it's in the rural designation, I believe that ag rises up to be a use co-equal with residential. When it's in the estates and residential general plan designation, it seems to be very clear that the zoning ordinance says that residential is the primary use. So the question therefore becomes one or two: is it appropriate to allow commercial cannabis cultivation in a zone which has a general plan designation which is not rural, and that rural designation is what's applied to the ag lands across the county? And I would argue that along with my colleague Dan, that residential agricultural zoned parcels and the estates and residential general plan designations are primarily meant to be residential and should not be allowed for commercial cannabis cultivation. The question therefore comes up with residential agricultural parcels in the rural general plan designation. And there again, it rises up, residential is co-equal with agriculture. And I'm not sure what that means, quite frankly, because it seems to me that when you're dealing with a profit-generating ag use, that use is going to, in the mind of the property owner, supersede the residential aspect. And I, and just looking at other policy language in both the zoning ordinance or the land use and development code, the section header that's printed prior to the definitions of the rural district says that the purpose of the section, number 3, to protect residential neighborhoods from incompatible land uses and excessive noise, illumination, unsightliness, odor, smoke, and other objectionable influences. And this is not part of the handouts, unfortunately. I came up with this about 2 hours ago. But for me, this guides my perspective, which is that even for the res ag parcels in the rural zone, I would argue that we still need to protect those parcels from the negative impacts of cannabis cultivation, which is primarily odor, traffic, light. So that's my perspective.
Can I ask for a clarification on that? Getting away from the policy piece, the actual practice. Are horses and cows and other crops allowed in res ag designated areas?
Yes, they are.
Okay, so I'm going to have trouble with the policy conversations if we aren't being consistent. And I want to just make sure I emphasize that I agree that where there are neighborhoods, whether it's RA or not, whether it's a neighborhood where there's, impacts are an issue, we need to look at the size of the parcel. So I'm open to restricting it based on the size, but if we're allowing ag and res ag lots.
Well, the question is commercial, and I think that's where the line is drawn. So I appreciate your perspective, but as I see it, someone raising, a few grapevines to make wine in one's house, someone with a barn that has horses for the family, rather than a stable where they're renting out horseback rides. To me, those if it's a hobbyist pursuit, I don't see that. I see that as a different sort of use than a commercial use, which is intended to generate profit, and which tends to have much more intensive use of the property, and something which is hobby related or personal related.
Okay, so if I could just ask further clarification on that, then that other crops and animals in RA designation, those are folks who aren't selling fruit in a fruit stand or otherwise doing any commercial activities? Is that not allowed?
That they may.
They may.
That would be allowed under
Okay.
that current zoning. But I think the question that we might need to drill down to in this case, for personal cultivation outdoors with an RA designation and maybe splitting it between the estate and the rural,
Yes.
what would it be for personal 0 to 6 plants on an RA in the estate? Being that we've clarified the R1, 2, R3, that would be the next one to drill down to.
Okay.
RA estate, outdoor personal cultivation. That would be the question I'd pose to your board.
I think
based on
that'd be
the
a good place to
discussion.
start, yeah. And I would suggest we ought to allow it there.
Ought to allow it in RA?
In RA estate, so the 3 acre plus, correct?
Well,
For personal use. That's just 6 plants.
We've got it now restricted 5 acres and less any outdoor in RA and our estate.
Right now, meaning the interim ordinance?
Yes.
Then that's an ordinance that was never voted on.
Never obeyed.
That's the one,
Certainly,
well, that's the
but
one that we're overturning.
We're still looking at impacts on a neighborhood, Heidi. We're looking about odor and whether it belongs in a neighborhood. And residential ag areas in my district are neighborhoods. And that's where my complaints are coming from, again. And that's why I'm looking at being restrictive as far as RA parcels up to 5 acres.
Okay, that looks like an area of disagreement. I'm suggesting 3 acres and above might be reasonable.
I'd entertain that question of taking the RA zoning separately of the sub-designations with those, maybe a minimum acre size discussion. That is another way to approach the RA discussion, is just talking about just minimum acre size.
Except larger parcels can be subdivided into smaller parcels.
And this
So-
is just, and we're talking personal use too.
We
We're
are
not talking
trying to
commercial,
focus on personal
anything.
right
We're
now.
still talking personal use.
Correct.
I tend to agree with Dan.
So recap exactly what that agreement is.
Oh, thank you.
If I may, Supervisor Miller, in the RA designation, would a minimum parcel size make a difference in your comments?
In the number of plants allowed?
Allowed or not?
Yes. Yeah, it makes sense that parcel size would make a difference. But for personal outdoor, anything under 5 acres, I would say no outdoor cultivation.
Supervisor Schofield, would beginning that you were trying to mimic Supervisor Miller's comments, so I'd hear a minimum size of 5 acres.
I believe so.
Yes, 5 acres.
Supervisor Anderson?
For personal use in the RA zone, I would say if it's zoned RA, 2 plants allowed, irrespective of parcel, 6 plants indoors, and then subtracting from those indoor plants, 2 plants outdoors, irrespective of parcel size in the RA zone. And with regard to the number of plants as the parcel sizes increase, I could see allowing up to 6 plants at a larger parcel size like 10 acres. But perhaps lower. I mean, my tendency is to be cautious with regard to adopting regulations that might be overly impactful. So I will naturally tend toward being overly restrictive rather than less restrictive.
I will definitely be the first one to say that this will probably likely require some fine tuning after we do get the first round of the ordinance stood up. And I almost guarantee there will be both necessity and reasons to make changes for it. So if we do start at one place, there will be opportunity to make adjustments in there if necessary, if something's working or not.
Personal use, depending on how good a person can grow, how do I say this? It's been shown that 1 pound of cannabis, you can produce about 800 joints. If you don't use it for smoking, then I'm not quite sure what you're going to be doing it for as far as turning it into tincture. But we're still talking personal use.
Correct. What happens to those would-be 6 plants after they come out of the ground? I think that we're getting a little bit into the minutia on that, Supervisor Miller. I think we're really trying to say, in certain zones, how many plants would you allow, and would you have any other restrictions on it based on the zoning type is where the discussion is at right now.
I think one of the concerns is if we say the 6, and that can be a lot of plants. And I think one of the concerns that I have is the same as the medicinal argument that we had for years, and that everybody was growing medicinal marijuana. Well, the truth is, they were growing whatever they could sell. I mean, that's the way it seemed to me. And the fact is, if you say you can grow 6, why not grow 10 or 12? And I think we'd get an awful lot of that too. But to get it started, I agree with what Dan has said. And again, I think we really need to be looking at the commercial aspect of it. What's the number of a commercial grow, and how do we get the licensing procedure started?
Okay, that's our next discussion.
I gotta just make one final comment about that. Actually, I appreciate this good conversation. I think this is a great way to get where we're gonna go. I just want to make sure that this conversation is balanced. We absolutely need to protect the neighborhoods. I think we're all in agreement of that. But I want us to remember that by allowing regulated grows, it's the way we can do the enforcement properly, and we will have the money coming in to make sure that people are meeting what the regulations we put in place. So to my mind, I'm always looking at how do we control it better as well, which the regulations would help us do. So I just want to put that out there.
But Chair, if I may just make an addendum to that, how do we ensure that the regulations we put in place don't simply perpetuate the impacts that are occurring right now? That's my concern, is that we have impacts that are occurring right now in defined residential ag areas, defined residential areas, and and in neighborhoods which frankly fall within the ag zoned areas. And that is going to be a really interesting question to deal with. But, you know, if we simply adopt regulations which perpetuate the impacts, we've gained nothing in terms of protecting neighborhoods. And that's one area where frankly I think we've been failing as a county, is protecting neighborhoods from the unneighborly impacts that are created through intensive cannabis cultivation.
I think what you're getting into is the fact that when we have a ban or a virtual ban, there's really no respect for the regulations in many cases, and it's very difficult to enforce because you have to enforce against everyone. So again, to my mind, if you have decent regulations and you've got a large population here who's ready, saying they're ready to abide by the regulations, then we're going to have a bit more control of it. Ultimately, I'm looking at, depending on how much we allow and if we can get a tax measure in place, what we're seeing in the counties that are successful is that as money is coming in, that goes back to good programs as well as enforcement to make sure we have enough staff out there doing the enforcement that's needed. But again, we need to have the right regulations in place to do that.
But then again, we're talking personal right now. You're talking commercial.
I just jumped over to mention that, but absolutely on the personal, we do the right regulations on the personal as well, and we're dealing with a lot of those impacts if we get it right. That's my point.
And I don't disagree with that, Heidi. I think the regulation is what we've been lacking, and it's absolutely what we need. And in fact, some of the biggest complaints that I've had in my district really are commercial grows in areas where I know we aren't going to, and we aren't talking 6 plants, we're talking 100, 200, 300, 1,000 plants. I mean, that's the type of thing we really want to stop and get a hold on. And define what that commercial number is going to be for what I would see as a boutique industry in Nevada County and where that could be.
And Mr. Chairman, I think if I'm reading the tea leaves right here, as far as an RA estate designation, I'm predominantly hearing no, but on an RA rural, maybe a 5-acre minimum acreage designation, would that be a fair assessment?
General plan experts, what define the estate? What's the major difference in the estate?
Supervisor Schofield.
We've been talking about RA estate.
RA estate would be that the residential is the primary focus in that decision-making, whereas opposed to rural, the ag and the residential are equal.
Okay. Thank you.
So
who are you talking to?
So if I can jump in, I was hearing, here's what I heard. Residential ag estate, 3 acres, 5 acres, 5 acres, 10 acres minus, 5 acres.
I heard 5 acres more than that, and I think that splits the difference in the range. So on the rural, that would be a 5-acre minimum designation. And to throw out additional disclaimer, this will help us start us framing up the ordinance. You will still have more than ample opportunity later to even refine this a little bit more if you feel we need to make some adjustments in the numbers.
So make sure the audience understood.
Yeah, I think that's a point we really need to make clear. Whatever we come up with here is to formulate a draft ordinance, and there will be ample opportunities, I promise you, for public comment and public input.
And so what Sean was just saying is that the consensus was 6 plants outdoors for personal grows in RA 5 acres and larger. Is that correct?
RA estate, 5 acres and larger.
Estate 5 acres and larger.
RA residential, RA estate.
Rural. No, the RA, I heard that RA estate would be a no, unless I did not get that.
Right.
No, what's what we've been talking about is RA estate.
Yeah, RA estate and RA are basically similar designations.
Is RA residential and RA estate the same?
I don't know what RA residential is.
I'm going to phone a friend on that to our zoning administrator.
Hello, Brian.
Yeah, they talk about it, right?
Good afternoon. RA residential would be the smallest parcels generally, about 1.5 acres or less. RA estate would be more in the 3-acre range and up to potentially about 5 acres. And then the RA rural is 5 acres or more generally. That is not across the board. There are certainly anomalies and other parcels that don't exactly meet it, but that's that's the progression, is the residential is the smallest, estate is medium, rural is the larger.
Okay, so from my perspective, R1, R2, R3, RA residential, and RA estate, anything less than 5 acres, no outdoor for personal use. RA rural, yeah, after 5 acres.
And to make sure I'm clear, 2 plants in any of those zones, up to any parcel size, or down to any parcel size, and then along with my colleague Hank and I think it's Dan, 6 plants in the RA zone under the rural designation.
You're the only one
Anderson, I
that's
haven't.
two.
I know, I'm the outlier on that one.
Okay.
I have not heard any of your colleagues comment on a lower plant threshold designation. I've been kind of framing this argument around the up to 6 plants. Is there a desire to maybe add a lower tier to that?
No.
Not for
No.
me.
There's no interest, that's fine.
So okay.
Want me to read this back one more time?
Where'd the 2 plants come from for me?
That's for Richard's use.
That was part of the negotiation tactic down there.
So,
So I'm still saying RA, R1, 2, and 3, under 5 acres, no
No.
outdoor.
right. And then what was your number after 5? Did you have a number?
The 6, that
6 after 5.
But let me rewind for a little bit of clarity right here. Earlier, we said that there would be no R1, R2, R3. That would be regardless of parcel size. Has that changed at all?
No.
Okay. So, and then as far as RA estate, would that have a minimum parcel size to say yes?
over 5 for me.
Over 5.
5.
So RA estate over 5, yes. RA rural over 5, yes.
And I'm the outlier there. I'm saying 3 acres.
I think for discussion purposes, I think we'll go with 5 with the majority, but again, room to fine tune later. All right, I think that wraps up our Rs. And then I would open it up to the rest of the designations, the AG, the AE, the FR, and the TPZ is probably the most relevant ones. I definitely think those zoning designations fall more into the commercial discussion, but you could have that person that lives on an ag parcel that only engages in personal cultivation. So definitely I think the Rs was the tougher conversation.
Sean, didn't the CAG drop TPZ out of the?
The CAG did drop
recommendations?
TPZ out of the recommendations, that's correct.
So, okay, here's a point. You're talking about not in zones. There's an anomaly out there in the Sunset where there's a house on a corner and it's zoned C1. Weird. Surrounded by parcels that are RA. Now, how do you, and there is a grow on that half-acre parcel. That's being one of the complaints from the neighborhood. So is that what you're talking about here?
No, that would be, well, is that a personal grow or is that a commercial grow?
It's a I didn't ask him. I didn't ask him.
I would chalk that one to maybe an anomaly because as far as personal cultivation, we are trying to figure out by zoning where that would allowed and where it is not. And we are talking more tying things to residents. That is one thing that's on one
Almost
of our
like
yes
an
nos.
exclusionary zone that Sarah was talking about, wherever she went, yeah.
That particular situation, I think, would be a little bit of an anomaly.
I guess I would consider, for the purposes of getting us to the commercial, the bigger, to start with 6 outdoor on the other zones that you just mentioned.
So, if we did fall in line a little bit with the CAG did discussion, that would fall under the AG, the AE, and the FR.
Right.
If your board is
personal.
amenable for that, for personal.
Yeah. So then if we agree 6 outdoor personal use on those zones to start with, then we can move to
Over
commercial.
5 acres?
My next question was, is there any minimum parcel size to that discussion if we are talking 6 plants for personal?
Are there parcel sizes under 5 or 3 acres with the designation?
Very few, but yes.
Well, Molly's table shows us exactly how many parcels there are under
That
those
wasn't-
designations.
I didn't see that one until an hour ago, so.
Two.
Someone's going to have to explain it to me.
Well, 2AE, but AGFR, so we have 13, 14, roughly 1,400 parcels of the AE, AG, and FR designations under 3 acres in size. And that more than doubles if you look at under 5 acres in size. So 3,000 plus parcels, 5 acres and below, or below 5 acres that are designated AE, AG, and FR. And I think an important consideration is that we have a number of residential neighborhoods. They're not so designated by the county but they're still neighborhoods, but they're situated within ag zones. Thoroughbred Loop, I think in Dan's district, for example, residential neighborhood, but it would not receive the benefit that's provided under the RA zones, and I think that's something that's a lack in how we're approaching land use planning in this county.
And again, I would have to say, if we're allowing other ag on those, if it's zoned ag and we're allowing other ag on those areas, unless we have a really good reason to restrict cannabis ag, we need to be treating it more or less equally at this point.
And I would argue that we do have a reason, which are the odor impacts from the cultivation of cannabis.
We have similar odor impacts with other, especially in ag zones.
No.
Okay,
And I've received letters to those.
okay.
So I guess if I could.
I would, in order to get this kind of going, I would lean towards the CAG's recommendation, AGAE, FR, TPZ, 6 plants for personal use.
Where are you? The TPZ would not be included in that CAG recommendation, Supervisor Schofield.
Well, that's what you've got under there.
Did I? Yeah.
Refer to 1.1,
Oh, excuse me,
Sean.
personal, that's right. That was for commercial. Molly just clarified for me, thank you. Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
TPZ would be included in that.
Okay, are we
For
still
personal.
talking personal?
For personal, correct.
No, I'll go with the CAG on that one.
I'm with you on that, Ed.
And so do we have a minimum parcel size that would apply to those zones?
I would say not at this point. I think we could, we could discuss that.
I agree.
Okay. All right, and then moving on, probably going back, and I'd probably break this into a two-parter, talking specifically about the RAs, because I think they fall into kind of a separate category than the AGs and the AC, but talking about minimum setback, if we would apply a minimum setback to those plants to make sure that we are mitigating those impacts. So probably bringing it back to that RA discussion, would a setback apply to those designations with that 5-acre minimum?
I was thinking 100 feet setback is a good sort of middle, or an area where what other counties are doing that looks pretty good. I was intrigued by Sarah's suggestion of this inclusionary, exclusionary zones, and I've seen plenty of information about the need to be, have more personal attention to the properties to see if 100 feet makes sense. Some might need less, some might need more. So I'm a little, I would like to have more information about that, honestly, to see if that's possible. But a starting point to me would be 100.
Thank you.
Mine is also 100, but in all of these setbacks, there needs to be some type of a variance program put in place, because my 100-foot goes into the other part too, but we have to have some procedure for a variance for irregular lots, different reasons. So, I mean, maybe you don't discuss it here, but at some point, then I think it needs to be discussed, or needs to be put in.
I agree with that, too.
Yes. Supervisor
Brian,
Anderson.
Thank you, Chair. With regard to variances, do they typically involve a public hearing? I mean, are neighbors notified and there's a hearing before the zoning administrator, or where the neighbors can come in and provide input regarding the desirability of a variance?
Yes, Supervisor Anderson, it is a required public hearing. It is noticed. It's noticed in the paper. Property owners within 300 to 500 feet, depending on the rural nature of the property, are notified, and then there are certain criteria and findings that are required to be made by the county, and it is an open public hearing that people can comment on the staff report and whatever's being proposed to be varied from the standards.
Okay, thank you. Well, then I think I agree with Hank.
I agree with Hank. And this is just kind of throw it out there. I think Diana brought it up. Variances, use permits, I think it is something that we can kind of take a look at in the future.
Okay. So I heard a 100-foot setback for those RAs with maybe researching potentially what some type of variance process may look like.
Yep.
As far as then moving that over to the other category being the AG, AE, FR, TPZ, any more discussion on what setback would apply to that, or would stick with the same number? We open that up to question to the board.
I think the same number, 6 plants, 108 feet.
Any other comments on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this should come under the commercial discussion, but Sonoma had, or has what seems to be a two definition setback, 100 feet to the property line, 300 feet to the neighboring residence. I'd like to ask staff to ask Sonoma how that's worked for them, because I'm kind of curious to see if it's effective.
We can do that.
Thank you.
Okay, I think with that, we get down to one more critical question is talking about when we are talking about personal cultivation, whether we would require a resident onto and a clarifier or the adjacent parcel, because you do have folks that own two parcels. They got vacant land on one side, house on the other, and then maybe it's just split by what they have. But is that there would have to be an improved permitted residence on the parcel and improved property to have that outdoor cultivation, and that is strictly comes into play with enforcement. What I like to call is that you have a door to knock on if there has issue versus allowing personal cultivation on vacant property. So that's our question for the board on that.
So explain adjacent. Somebody owns 2 pieces of property, the house is on one, and they have another 3 or 4 acres on the other side, and they want to plant on the other side?
Correct.
Same owner?
Same owner.
Okay with me.
I've heard that scenario more often than not through the
Yeah.
CAG process, that it just happens to be that's what the property they've ended up coming to own, or years ago they bought the adjacent parcel, but we would treat it as a one owner and treat it contiguous as far as the regulation.
I'd agree with that.
I would too.
And then I think a few comments that I heard through the discussion to kind of wrap up personal would be, as far as wherever the plants are located, some things that we do borrow from the existing ordinance to mitigate impacts: fencing, locked gates, and screening. So don't want to get too much into the details on that, but I would call it a good, honest effort to not be having that in full view of your neighbors through some reasonable requirements, and we would frame up some of the minutia in that in the ordinance.
Would you explain what you mean by opaque fence, because it is ugly?
That's basically anything that's translucent. You can kind of see through it, but you're not sure what it is. That's the best way to describe that.
No, I think that's a bigger eyesore than the actual grow.
I agree with Hank.
It's almost considered temporary fencing.
We could review opaque if that's the board's request.
I think just a regular fence is nice, you know?
Well, what is the purpose of the fencing?
That is, let's say your neighbor doesn't necessarily agree with your personal cultivation, that why they might know you're doing it, that then they actually can't see it. So they would look into your neighbor's property and they wouldn't necessarily see the plants there. You'd make an honest effort to actually screen it. We've heard that from the other side of the argument.
I tend to agree that, I mean, anytime now you see these lovely bamboo fences, or they look horrible, and you know exactly what's behind them.
If it's being grown for personal use, do I really care if it's visible to the neighbors?
That's the question we're asking before. I think when it is fenced, the security aspect gets a little bit easier. I think if you do not require a fence, the security then, that's kind of tough to do one without the other.
But a fence may, by its very existence, indicate that there's something to be stolen there. That's one of the issues. I mean, to me at least, having having a couple of plants, behind the house, the neighbors can do the same thing, not a big deal, which was to the gist of my comments earlier. 6 plants, same way. I think we're in an era where the growing of cannabis for personal use isn't something which is extraordinary. It's something which is becoming ordinary. Having it not visible from the public right-of-way, from roads or parks or schools, I think has utility for the property owner, because it does help provide security. But in terms of hiding it from the neighbors, I don't think they're really going. I mean, what they'll be more concerned about, I suspect, is as Mr. Head indicated, the stench, the odor, but from my personal perspective, I don't necessarily see any need for fencing or for limiting the height of the plant to fence height.
Well, if we're talking 100-foot setback from the property line, but 300 feet from the next door neighbor's residence, I kind of lean to agree with Richard. Is what's the sense of the fence if you're 300 feet away? You're out in a wooded area.
Where did 300 feet all of a sudden come in?
Oh, that was Richard's idea.
That's something which is going to be looked at by staff.
Perhaps we can look at
Supervisor
this
Anderson's
as a,
borrowing that from Sonoma's.
Okay.
And I believe actually Placer has the same thing. You have your setback from your property line, and there's additional setback that takes into effect your neighbor's configuration. There is a lot of debate on whether your setback and what you do should be contingent on what your neighbor's property has. And then, of course, then a neighbor could hypothetically do an improvement on the property, then to change that setback to affect the neighbor, depending on their disagreement. We can definitely review it, but it does have its challenges.
I was going to say, I would think that becomes very restrictive.
Yet, I wonder if the variance would take care of that issue, that there may be variances required for that sort of thing.
But I remember the fence discussion, and the fence discussion really centered more around kids getting into the plot, not about neighbors looking at it or somebody. It was mainly for kids who were walking back and forth to school, doing something, see it grow, and and make a move. This was just mainly for safety for kids, the first discussion on fences. So that's, I'm not worried about the neighbor part. I'm worried about the kids that were just.
Well, then you muddy the waters a little bit more, because then we have to get into a discussion of what can a neighbor do to curtail, say, his next door neighbor is growing pot and his kids being exposed to it. And, then on a personal grow, that gets to be a little squirrely.
Well, right, but the fence was back over on the medical side and on larger grows, and so they took that language from the original, which that was put in because of kids going by. Right.
let's deal with that later with the details. It's just something that we can take a look at. Let's move on.
If I could, Ed, I just have, the one thing I'm concerned about, it's not the fence. I don't really have a strong opinion on that. But in previous ordinances, growers had some issues with the way the regulations were written, which made it very difficult to comply. So the type of fencing, the type of security. So I'd like to ask you to work with the Alliance or some growers to help come up with something that makes sense and is clearly articulated.
Okay. All right, and then kind of a closing point on that, to review definitely what the CAG came up with. Those are in your 1.1 to 1.6 in your summary table. And I think we did a pretty good job capturing that. So that's the end of our warm-up exercise. So just a quick review. We are moving the conversation from personal to commercial. This is definitely the area I was excited about to get the conversation after our very short warm-up exercise. Just a quick review on kind of the state license, and this is just a snapshot to get everyone familiar with the language again, because this did change in the state regulations that came out in November. The naming conventions as far as how they categorize their license types did change, and who knows, they might change again. But when you talk any state license, you do have to specify your M or A designation, medical or adult use, regardless of what you're doing. If you're going to do both, you need to get 2 licenses from the state. And definitely just looking at a partial list for the outdoor, The terms you got to be familiar with: specialty cottage, specialty outdoor, small outdoor, and medium outdoor. That's kind of just the language that we'll be discussing through this, and a little reference point of really what those mean. And the state's actually got a good PDF now out that's available that's got a good snapshot of really what those mean, not to go through the 100 pages of regulations to find the definition of those. So we get into some of our Q&A and our decision points for the commercial cultivation. I know your board was eager to get into those, so a few of the yes/no questions we have, hopefully starting out with some of the easy ones, because those state license types, if we're going to provide that local authorization and engage in that type of activity, we would need to designate whether they were an A or an M designation. So I thought I'd start with the easy one and say, if we do say yes to commercial cultivation in Nevada County, would we entertain looking at the medical designations?
Yes.
Who are you asking?
Yeah, you. Yeah, so frame that
Okay,
question
I'm
to the board.
for medical, at this point in time, medical only until the state gets all of their adult stuff fixed up. I'm not discounting it, but I think we need to, as you said, bite the elephant a little bit at a time. Let's make sure our medical is proper, and so that's my feeling.
I'd like to suggest that we allow medical. I'd like to see it on AG, AE, FR, et cetera, those zones, same restrictions as we would have in commercial. I'd like to allow cannabis nurseries in AG and AE, and medical collectives as the CAG outlined.
Well, you went way past that one question.
Medical,
Oh, okay, I thought we was gonna step through it, okay.
that's my step.
Just take a big step. It's okay. Flexibility is the name of the game today.
All right.
Other supervisors?
Yeah,
on those
I don't have a problem at all with medical. I think that's what drives our conversation right now.
I agree.
Okay, so I'm hearing allow medical, yes, and something that would might prove prudent is if, as we stand up the medical, put a process in place, get into licensing that works, it would be very easy to then mirror that for adult use, because I think it would borrow a lot of those provisions from the same thing with that designation. So definitely focusing on the medical would be a good start. So going back to Supervisor Hall's, when we start talking about, I guess it would be medical commercial cultivation as far as the allowed zones for the type of activity. And we're talking the cultivation, not so much supply chain, but outdoor cultivation on a commercial scale, allowed zones that we would consider that in.
So your question is which zones we might allow?
Medical commercial cultivation, correct.
Medical/commercial cultivation.
Well, not
Medical,
slash, medical commercial.
commercial.
It's both.
Are the commercial licenses, do they apply to medical?
When you apply for a commercial license with the state of California,
Yeah.
you have to pick your letter.
Okay, so I'll start. Specialty cottage, outdoor and indoor, on AG, AE, and FR, plus RA above a certain acreage. Specialty, outdoor, indoor, AG, AE, FR, 5+ acres. And small, same, 10+ acres, outdoor, indoor, AG, AE, FR, and I believe an RA is larger acres. I believe these are the CAG recommendations.
Okay, yeah, you're going pretty fast there, but I think
Sorry,
I
you
got
can
it.
look at the CAG, the CAG sheet.
Did the definitions change the cottage and small from what CAG was looking at?
No, it was more, by the time the CAG took on the commercial discussion, we had actually already had the new license type designation. So we were in the 2 meetings of the recommendation phase. We were talking about the same numbers and naming conventions that were on that previous slide.
So they said allow small commercial cultivations in areas zoned AGAE
Correct.
and RA.
Hold it, say that.
If you want to take a quick reference to your CAG summary table, that'd go down to 3.4.
That's what I'm looking at.
Just a minute.
I believe it's on the third page, about the middle of the page.
Right.
Item number 3.4.
Right.
We had strong agreement on the designations and then moderate agreement on the sizing.
I mean, we're starting to put commercial into an area we just said we couldn't do personal growth.
That is one area that we'd probably have to refine a little bit based on the discussion that we just heard. There's definitely been some discussion on whether commercial activity would be allowed in an RA zone, and we might have to split that designation on the designation of whether it's the estate or the rural.
Well, I think if we're not allowing it for personal grow, we sure aren't going to allow it for commercial, I wouldn't think.
Would that be on the RA?
RA.
Yeah.
RA estate and RA rural over 5 acres? Because we did allow the personal on the RA estate of 5 acres or more. So would the commercial apply to an RA
We just said
estate?
no more than 6
Okay.
on an RA over.
Yeah, just getting that clear.
Did we define what commercial is? I mean, we don't.
Well, commercial is going to be 7 plants or more,
It is?
potentially based on
Did
your
we determine
discussion.
that? Is that?
I'm not asking that question now, but a lot of those license types that you're talking about, if you actually flip back, you are talking about at least 25 plants, and then when you start talking about those square footages, definitely your plant goes, the state has kind of a inferred amount of 100 square feet per plant, as some of their numbers that they extrapolate from the regulations, but a lot of the regulations have just a square footage designation.
Specialty cottage.
So I think that might be a good time to open up the discussion specifically on RA as far as medical commercial activity.
But that's a separate license. You're not licensing personal use.
No.
So we're talking a specific license. So there is a difference. I mean, you're going to apply for a commercial license, which then connotates something different than just your personal use.
Correct. That would require both the state license and their requirement, our local authorization to engage in activity on a parcel that has those parameters,
Right.
and also any additional requirements that we might require that doesn't conflict with the state regulations. So the question is, if we're in that discussion, discussing an RA parcel, what would be the minimum criteria for that to kick in?
Well, now we're going to actually, we should be going to residential rural if we're talking commercial.
Potentially, if that's the direction from your board.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're trying to get at the same, residential estate, residential rural, above 5 acres. And I just want to point out to your comment, Hank, that it is different because they'd have to get a license, and they'd have to apply for water control licenses, pests, all the stuff that you don't have to do with a personal. So it is
Right.
different that way as
Right.
well. It's going to be much more controlled.
Right. That's, the issue was, well, we approved 6 there. Can we be doing more? Yes, we can, because we have a specific license for it. So, you want to hear what, mine was acreage. I didn't break it down into zoning because the zoning would all fall in.
Is that specifically for RA or all the zones, Supervisor
Also,
Weston?
well, anything. I just use acreage. So I did 5 to 10 is a cottage, 100-foot setbacks. 10 to 20 is a specialty, that's a 200-foot setback. And 20 plus is 100 plants, not 10,000 square feet, up to 100 plants, 200 setback, and that's considered small. That's how I broke it down. It was easier and just leave the zoning as it is, whatever the zoning is.
So what does that mean for a 5-acre parcel?
Hmm?
I'm asking Sean, what does that mean for a 5-acre parcel? What is the plant count
25.
25.
for a 5-acre?
Up to 25.
For a 5-acre parcel?
5 to 10,
Well,
yeah.
if you're talking a specialty cottage on that, that would be up to 25 plants. You'd have to, if we're going to follow the state framework, you'd have to pick the license type that was applying to that 5-acre parcel, and whether that 5-acre parcel could move up or down on the state license type for as far as volume.
We can go down on that.
if you want to go down.
If you see the state methodology, regardless of how they label them, but the highlighted section, or the bold section, excuse me, as you go up between the cottage, the outdoor, the small, and the medium, your size of your grow, or the up to numbers, I like to call it, does increase. And we can adopt those as is, or we can establish numbers within those, because you could have potentially, you could cap small outdoor at a number between 5,000 and 10,000 and still allow a small outdoor because it fits within the state parameters.
Why wouldn't we want to be looking at the acreages as the primary variable?
That is something we'd like some direction from your board on from that, because
If I recall, the CAG recommendation had 2 acres for specialty cottage, or maybe, was it 3 acres? Was it 2 acres? And so 25 mature plants, 2 acres, three acres. And I thought that was indoor, right? Or was that 25 outdoor with the CAG recommendation?
3 acres outdoor, 2 acres indoor for specialty cottage.
Yeah.
3.3.2 and 3.3.1 on your chart, if you've got it.
Yeah, and one of the recommendations was 50 plants on 5 acres, which is when I started having severe heartburn.
Yeah.
Again, I don't understand why we would say no personal growth on 5 acres or under, and yet now we're going to say we're going to allow a cottage industry or a specialty cottage to grow 25, even though it's licensed.
Definitely, we do see the minimum acreage size as maybe engaging in commercial activity or not. That might actually be the more simple question, that if you had, at least X acres or more, that would be the threshold for any type of commercial activity. That might be a simpler way to rephrase the question.
And we're out of residential areas now. To my mind, we're into areas that are not going to be impacting neighbors.
Well, no, we are into areas that have no formally defined residential areas. Defined that as under the zoning code, but we do have neighborhoods that exist, but they exist under the ag zones, and that's where the problems happens. I mean, you and I have a disagreement, which is appropriate, but as I see it, a lot of people moved to this county because they wanted an outdoor lifestyle. They wanted to live among the trees and the fields and get away from suburban and urban life. And up until, I mean, we've had grows on the ridge and elsewhere in the county for decades, but there has been an explosion in cannabis grows in western Nevada County in the last 10 years, 15 years or so. And a lot of people who moved here for a rural lifestyle are now quite surprised to find that, Mr. Head, I thought, actually described the issue in passionate terms, but it's an issue which a lot of people are concerned about, which is that what they moved here for is vanishing from the impacts of cannabis. And again, I'm not somebody who's against cannabis, but I am somebody who recognizes that one's home is one sanctuary, and it's where one escapes from the workaday world, from the trials and tribulations that we face every day as citizens of this country. And it's so, I've always tried to fight for the quality of life of residents, and that quality of life seems to me to be vanishing, not just, well, it's vanishing in the ag zones for people who are living in neighborhoods in the ag zones, or frankly are living just near grows which have impacts on them. But it's also vanishing to a certain extent within the RA zones. I have family living on Willow Valley, and which is primarily RA zoning, but under res, estate, and rural general plan designations. And is that an appropriate area for commercial grows? My own inclination is no.
No, commercial doesn't belong in any R zone property. I agree with you, Richard. It has to stay out in ag and areas that are designated for ag commercial activities. You're right. There's neighborhoods in residential rural. There's that are going to be impacted if you put 25 plants on a 5-acre piece of property, even though it's designated res rural, you're going to impact your neighbors. And that's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to avoid the neighborhood fights and reduce the number of man hours the county's going to have to spend running around policing this. And we're having a hard time doing that now. So why increase our problem by, allowing commercial in those types of areas? And I know we need regulations, and I understand regulations, but commercial activity needs to be in properly zoned areas. And I've heard both sides of the cannabis community are, we're getting mixed signals from both sides. Somewhat fewer regulations where they can do commercial, and somewhat stricter regulations where they can do commercial to remove the bad people who really don't give a rip about our county. So we have to approach this in a pretty deliberate and thoughtful way, and I think this is the way to do it, is keep commercial outside where it belongs.
So hearing Supervisor Schofield's comment and same with Supervisor Anderson, Supervisor Miller, I guess it's still come back, I'm hearing that then no commercial in RA at all?
At all.
At all?
I agree.
Okay. And then as far as just the zoning type, following maybe the some of the CAG recommendations as far as the AG, the AE, and the FR, those are the appropriate zones for those cultivation medical license types?
I'd say yes, and I just want to throw the RA issue back. There is a difference between indoor and outdoor, and I just want to make sure you guys are taking that into consideration too, that we could have indoor commercial in the RA zone, which should not then be impactful at all if it's done right.
Well, the only impact it would probably have would be, a safety issue, as far as that in a parcel that size.
Right.
So you two guys are saying on RA period, no commercial growth.
Right.
That's what I would recommend.
Well, three of you, okay. So then, so what about indoor? There are people who are building or planning to build greenhouses. So what about enclosed on a 5 to 10 acre parcel that has odor control, which would end up being commercial? You're opposed to that too?
And
What size the building?
I don't know what size the building is. You have to have the odor control that passes to make it. I mean, that's what we heard on testimony, that there's odor control systems
Right.
in place.
well, I would argue no commercial in RA period. My colleague Heidi might say though that indoor in the RA designation under the rural general plan designation, which basically is an ag designation, is appropriate. Am I correct in saying that? And so that's the issue for you. Is indoor growing, presuming no trespassive impacts onto neighboring residential parcels? Is that something which is appropriate for RA rural?
And I would add, I think it's appropriate, but also I'm hearing loud and clear that you're concerned about odor. And so this is someplace where you can potentially control the odor, and so.
I just don't think that commercial cultivation is appropriate in rural ag zones, period. That's the line I've drawn from my own perspective. But I'm only 1 of 5, so.
Yeah, I'm leaning with Richard on indoor or outdoor in RA, no commercial.
And at this point, I do too.
So I think I'm still hearing that that'd be no commercial in the RA. And then to take the discussion back to the AG, the AE, and the FR, I heard a couple times minimum parcel size of maybe 5 acres to engage in that. Is that correct?
Or mine was parcel size, but they've brought up that they don't want any commercial in any RA. So, and I'm just looking,
We got that one.
got that,
We're done with that one, hey?
Yeah, Supervisor Weston,
Oh, I
we're
thought-
talking specifically AG, AE, and FR.
Oh.
And if you were talking those specific zones, would you apply a minimum parcel size for medical, commercial activity in those zones?
So, and I would refer back to the CAG recommendation. Again, we had people from multiple sides coming to the conclusion. So I'm not going back to RA. I'm with you now on the next group. But they were willing to go lower than 5 acres. So I'm kind of deferring to the CAG on this piece.
You know, you've heard my bias, but I have constituents and friends who are growing on small parcels in those zones as well as large parcels, and frankly, I'm really more intrigued as to what my colleagues might think, because their districts have far more parcels of that type than mine do. So I'm curious what Hank thinks, what Ed thinks, and what Dan thinks.
Well, I think we have to start creating areas where we can have these regulated growing. So, again, based upon that, I guess I honestly don't know the impact of what the neighborhood would be, but we have to start saying, okay, these are our areas that we can approve.
Well, I think definitely when you start talking AG, AE, and FR, if you were to pick a lower number, that gets definitely more inclusive. As Brian spoke to not too long ago, the smaller parcel size with those designations are a minimal population in the total parcels in the county. So definitely the lower you go, the more inclusive it would be.
Throw a number out, Brian.
I think I've heard both 3 and 5 acres mentioned in the discussion, if all my chicken scratch is correct.
Yeah, it's on page, the number 3 of the CAG recommendations. You could key off of that. That's helpful. Page 5, section 3.
So Heidi, what's your recommendation?
What's
Again.
my what?
What's your recommendation again?
My recommendation is, again, what's under tab 3, it's under called commercial cultivation on this one, but we're talking about medical commercial, which is specialty outdoor, minimum parcel of 5 acres, specialty cottage outdoor, minimum parcel 3 acres, specialty indoor and cottage and blah, blah, outdoor, indoor, whatever, parcel size 2 acres, this mix of indoor and, it's indoor, specialty and specialty cottage, 2 acres, and then the mixed light, 5 acres for specialty and 3 acres for specialty cottage.
To capture Supervisor's Hall comments, to kind of simplify it, we are trying to establish the floor. So if you did follow the CAG's recommendation, it would be 2 acres and then maybe we could do some tiering in there, which makes sense by certain license types. And we could definitely bring back some more information and frame that up around something that we think works. But with the CAG's recommendations, 2 acres would be the floor.
Myself,
I'm sorry.
well, I would say I would go along with Heidi on this and the CAG, with the understanding that with all this, we're going to be taking looks at it again, so.
Okay.
This is out in the ag.
So is this 2 acres indoor? I think it is, isn't it?
Well, I think we're trying to establish a floor for any type of commercial medical activity, and maybe we would put then some tiers on it depending if it was indoor or outdoor, but that way we can establish a threshold that we can build for if that's the policy direction from your board, saying that anything below 2 acres is out, anything 2 acres or more is in, and maybe we'll have to bring back some type of tiered structure that meshes well with the state license types and parcel size.
And impacts.
And impacts.
Yeah, but the CAG recommendation does start with 5 acres for the specialty outdoor.
Right, which is 50 plants for 5 acres.
Yeah. If the board so chose, we could put a little bit of clarification on that without getting too much in the nuance to say maybe the 2 to 5 range falls under indoor and maybe 5 and above is outdoor. That'd be another way to maybe simplify it a little bit.
I would limit the 5 acres to 25 rather than the 50.
Well, I don't think Sean's at that point. Sean is just asking
but
Yeah, if I could repeat that, maybe in the AG, the AE, and the FR, you're going to allow commercial, medical. The floor would be 2 acres. In a 2 to 5 acre range, you're going to focus on indoor. And then when you go 5 acres and above, you focus on the outdoor. And I think we could probably establish some
Just have to
tiering
set
and some parameters in there.
an area or a plant count on that.
I think that'd be enough direction for
Okay.
council and staff to maybe put something together that mirrors that.
Okay.
So with that, I think then the only thing that leaves is our favorite discussion is then the setbacks that would apply to that as well, given that framework. Specifically, if you had the AG, the AE, and the FR on a 2 to 5 acre commercial indoor, what type of setback would you be considering?
And I would go for the same, I think simplifying 100 feet, fence to grow,
On 2 acres?
600 feet from schools, and variances, where there are variances for where's needed.
Yeah, that's,
And it could go up for the larger size. The problem I have with that is sometimes when you get to the larger size, you're that much farther away from homes too, and really, you're gonna end up with a much bigger setback than what's required.
and we're talking 2 to 5 acres indoor right now.
And outdoor.
No, we established
No, no,
that
no, no.
5 acres or
Oh,
more
sorry.
would be outdoor.
Yeah, sorry.
We're indoor.
Okay. Well, then,
And then we'll have to discuss plant size. But the 600 feet away from a school for commercial, medical, I'm not feeling a lot of comfort with just 600 feet away from schools.
I have that as a separate item, as kind of a catch-all. I have that for you in the
Okay.
forward part of the presentation, Supervisor Miller. I think that'd be a good time to take that one on when we get to it.
We'll stop bringing it up.
On an indoor from 2 to 5, there needs to be odor control.
We can specify odor control in that on the indoor. That would be mitigation. There is some infrastructure they can put in those operations to help mitigate that.
And I still recommend policy language, which indicates there'll be no impact trespass across property lines.
And as far as jumping over then to add the outdoor on the 5 acres or more, what type of setback?
We're just throwing figures out, 100 feet?
We could start the conversation at 100, sure.
well, and these figures are, I mean, there's CAG recommendations, and then we have the information on what a number of the other counties are doing. So that's sort of what I'm trying to tear off of too. So we're consistent with other counties.
Yeah, and Sonoma has 100 feet. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not sure we want to necessarily be less than counties that are leaders in developing these sorts of regulations.
Leaders. Yeah, I like the 100 feet, makes sense.
So outdoor, 5 acre, and definitely with the higher acreage amount, there is a little bit more buffer in there, if you will, but at least starting the conversation around 100 square feet. That's what we were looking for.
100 linear feet. And you will be looking at what's happening in Sonoma regarding that 300.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, we're in regular conversations with our colleagues for as far as what's working and what's not. And we try to head down to Sacramento at least every couple of months. They're putting together meetings where I'll go down there and talk to 50 other jurisdictions on what they're doing, what's working, what's not, and definitely sharing information. We did actually kind of go through the exercise of developing a tiered minimum parcel size and setback. I've got a little snapshot of what that looks like, but I think your board's given us enough direction to at least maybe frame up a table on what medical commercial cultivation looks like for the county. And one other thing that kind of comes up as far as that, with folks that fall into a category of which they don't meet that criteria, you have somebody that's maybe been cultivating and all those policy directions that we just received, they just don't fit into that box. Would they potentially be allowed to grow on another person's property as long as the cumulative sum total of all of that cultivation fit in the box that we just established, being that we still have one primary permit holder as the ultimate responsible party for that? So if I'm allowed a certain amount, half of it's mine, half of it's somebody I'm allowing to grow on our property, we still have a primary permit holder that's ultimately responsible for that. But as long as you still fit in the box, that would be allowed. So that's more of a yes/no question for your board.
Yes.
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 Well, that's three. I think I got it, so.
Yeah,
Okay.
count to three, and Hank and I don't have to say anything.
Okay. All right. And then that was of substantial progress on commercial, so I do thank the board for that, and that does reflect all the CAG recommendations in 3.1 for 3.7 for future reference. This is a little bit of what that snapshot will look like for as far as us filling in the blank. And then this is just a snippet of the outdoor as far as what the specialty cottage and small would look like, as far as the amount, the minimum parcel size, and I think you gave us enough to fill in that blank on there. The other one to maybe talk about is actually nurseries. Those are kind of a little bit different. It does have, I think, lower impacts compared to some of the regular cultivation when you're only growing smaller plants. We're definitely looking at maybe a use permit for that, but then as maybe the parameter that we would have to establish for that, what is just the largest nursery that you would apply as far as a total amount of square feet. The state does specify a pretty large amount for that, and would be if we'd have any of the other parameters, because it is a different animal. So we could come up with some discussion on that, or the board could engage any discussions on how we should treat a nursery on that at this time.
May I ask Brian a question?
Sure.
Brian, do we have a dark sky ordinance? I know Truckee does, and I'm not sure about Nevada City or Grass Valley, but does the county?
So we have lighting standards. It's not consistent 100% with the Dark Sky Alliance regulations, but we do have lighting requirements that require lighting to remain on site, be hooded, and directed downward so there's not any spillage off-site.
And that's true for greenhouses also?
That would be yes.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I think we have to consider nurseries. The thing with nurseries, though, is not so much odor. Nurseries become a typical commercial businesses, the way I would see it. Maybe here again, you don't necessarily want that in residential neighborhoods, not because of odor, but because of traffic and those types of impacts.
Yeah,
So I think that nurseries certainly have less of an impact than outdoor crops do.
Yeah, and we would definitely focus on that and treating it more like a conventional business as far as that. But it does raise the question of, would you allow it to be up to a certain size? Like, let's say if you were going to match it with small operations, that maybe a nursery would have the same restriction. That would be up to a local control measure of a certain number if you were matching it by a license size. So I guess that would be the question we're posing to your board, if you would cap the size that a nursery could be by. I would consider that cultivation area. You are talking about just where the plants are located, not necessarily the size of the parcel or where any of the other ancillary operations would be.
That's one where I'd like to see what the other counties have done. That's not one I've had a lot of information on.
Okay.
The nurseries, you would think, would be more of a square foot size, and the same, again, if they were coming in as a commercial or retail establishment. So it really wouldn't matter what the number of plants were that they were cultivating, I don't think.
I would reference actually 3.5 on the CAG recommendation. A majority of the CAG had strong agreement that maybe, at least off the get-go, maybe a medium is a little bit too big for our britches right now, that maybe we would focus on the smaller ones to start, and then at a later time review larger licenses once we've got this up and underway. So if we borrowed that from the CAG, that would essentially put a quasi limit on the size of a nursery.
I think that's a great idea, and that also identifies AG and AE as the zones for that.
Yeah, and it keeps the Department of Food and Agriculture out of it too, on your medium size.
So Brian.
What is a small? How big is that?
Small is 5,000 to 10,000 square feet.
On zoned AE?
AG and AE.
Okay.
So Brian, the Juniper Hills neighborhood to the east and southeast of Truckee, what's the zone there again? Do you recall?
I'm sorry, which property?
The Juniper Hills, Martis Peak neighborhoods.
I believe that's Ag 20.
Yeah, Ag 20. Okay. And I know that there have been issues regarding greenhouses out there. There's the issue of snow load, among other things. would what we're proposing here override our greenhouse regulations for that area? Or frankly, for any area in Nevada County?
I don't believe so. Any type of structure is still going to have to meet building code requirements, and that's where the snow loads come from. So depending on elevation and location of where they're proposed, there are certain snow loads that any type of structure requiring a building permit would have to meet.
Supervisor Anderson, from the building department perspective, it's, you know, a greenhouse has to follow all your regular constructions and permitting standards. It's then when you put cannabis in it after construction of whether it would trigger any other additional requirements that might come from our cultivation ordinance.
I just think of one location in my district that's right off of Highway 49 that currently has greenhouse. And I don't see where it's an issue. So, and I don't know what the zoning is. It's probably more of a commercial zoning than an ag zoning.
Are there examples of greenhouses in Western Nevada County that are being utilized for crops other than cannabis?
I'm sure there's some of them out there. I haven't personally seen one, but plenty of folks might actually have a large greenhouse and have their own personal gardens in them, but those tend not to be the ones that we get involved with too often unless it's just an unpermitted building, and we might treat it accordingly like any other unpermitted structure. To kind of round out the nursery discussion, then, would nurseries be subject to any setback separately as a certain license types? I think there's definitely some other considerations as far as the mitigation that your board's discussed, but would those necessarily apply?
Wouldn't there be a building code that would address that?
Well, any construction of any improvements would be subject to the regular building setback,
Right.
only 30 feet. So it would be if your board would want to add anything to that.
Well, how about if it goes through the CUP process? I mean that could allow the neighbors to discuss it or to provide input in case there might be impacts coming from generators or lights or whatever. Would that make sense, Brian? I mean, does it work that way?
Supervisor Anderson, those are definitely the things that are looked at through the use permit to see how compatible the proposed use is on the site with, in relation to the neighborhood and the surrounding properties and residential uses and et cetera. So use permit is an avenue to apply certain setbacks depending on the level of impacts created by the proposed use.
It also allows the neighbors to provide, I presume it goes to the planning commission.
Again, all use permits do require some level of public hearing, either at zoning administrator or planning commission.
Okay. Well, I think in any kind of generators and lights both need to be addressed. The noise from generators that are going full-time and how lights, if you're lighting it up at night, what it does. I mean, you can put a hooded light, but you still have this big glow that sits there, and I think we have to deal with it because that's some of the complaints we get.
And Supervisor Weston, is that for any type of cultivation, whether it's personal or commercial? Just to clarify your point there.
So that is for any type of cultivation, where there would be a nuisance component to this?
We can include that in the ordinance as far as any of those specifications that Supervisor Weston just outlined.
I mean, right now there's commercial standards for lights and sound. This is commercial, so you have to have the same standard, or the standards, whatever they may be.
Yes, there are plenty of things from the building code that we can borrow.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't make something new for them. There's already, I think it's 55 decibels at the property line. I think that's what it reads, something like that, or a certain time and a certain lighting. I think what's good for one commercial is good for another.
I'd like us to be consistent with existing codes as much as we can be.
If you look at nurseries and it's truly a nursery and you're selling commercially nursery plants, there really isn't the nuisance issue there. Now, if they determine, okay, we've got these plants going, now we're going to turn it into a greenhouse, that's a whole separate issue. But I would assume they'd be going to the state to get licensed to be a nursery.
Being a nursery and engaging in commercial requires a state license. That is a specific license type with the state.
Are nurseries always indoors, or are there situations when they're outdoors?
I think it could be either or. depending on what the applicant is looking at.
You have direction there?
Yes, I do. Thank you,
Okay.
Supervisor. So that definitely wraps up. So that actually gets us, Supervisor Weston, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do have one. Under small, so specialty is 25 plants, 500 square feet. I don't know what the slash that means, but then it goes 50 plants or 5,000. But then on small, it doesn't say any plants. And I think there should be a maximum of 100 plants. I don't care what you put in there. Because I just went to a grow that there were 100 plants fit into a very nice setting, but there was 100 plants. But if you had 10,000 square feet, you probably could have had 400 plants. So under this small, there's nothing about plants.
Isn't that defined by the state license type?
The state license type defines it as square foot only. They do not have a plant count as one of the criteria in the state license, but a local jurisdiction can add to that if they chose to.
I'd want a little more information on that. I mean, I agree we may want to have a count, but I don't want to just have an arbitrary number. We need to know that folks, if they're going to get this license, can actually make a go of it, and that might require a certain amount of plant. So maybe we could get more information on that one.
If you look at the lower tiers of the state license types, it infers 100 plant per square feet. That's how the state numbers stack up as far as if you do the calculation from that. I don't know if that's ultimately what they did when they did their calculations, but there's some correlation there. And then when they get to the small and moving up, they completely go away from plant count. So that is one place to start the conversation as far as 100 per plant, as far as square footage goes. So that, I think, would jive with Supervisor Weston's math there.
And they don't distinguish between indoor and outdoor on the small. They're both 5,001 to 10,000 square feet.
They do have separate license types. Very limited on what I could.
License types, but they don't.
Yeah.
There's no there's no difference between the square footage on your outdoor small or indoor small.
There, I got the cheat sheet right here. Correct. Small outdoor and small indoor have the same numbers. I was just limited on how much I was going to hit you with on the slide here, but that's why we do have that link in there, and it does have kind of a rough cheat sheet on what some of the numbers are, and there is not much variation between indoor and outdoor as far as the allotment of area.
So all we have to decide is, what's the minimum parcel size on that for outdoor or indoor?
Well, as far as the commercial, I thought I had heard that your board already established that. We're at 2 to 5 for indoor, 5 and above for outdoor.
On the small?
Well, that'd actually be for any, but I think what we want to do is bring back a tiered structure that maybe fits into that baseline parameter, because there's a lot of variation that could occur in that, and for discussion. But those were kind of the floor numbers as far as that. And then I think what Supervisor Weston was bringing up is that if we did allow small, would you put a plant count on that or not? And so I think so far we've only heard from Supervisor Weston on that.
Always keep in mind cross-property line impacts, please.
I need more information on that one too.
Okay, so I think maybe we'll put a question mark if there's a plant count there. Maybe we can take that up, maybe look at what some other jurisdictions are doing, but at least we'll bring some suggestions, maybe a range, and see what we could find for that. So we'll put that as a question mark, but definitely have a plant count discussion for any commercial licenses that don't specify a plant count.
What if we looked at the maximum number of plants that could be allowed under 10,000 square feet and simply define the acreage requirement based upon impact mitigation?
That is one way we could look at it. And unfortunately, there's some, as far as how big people grow plants, and I think that's why the state went to just square footage. A person might grow a lot of very small plants or grow large, very few plants and anything in between. So I think that's where that's actually a tough nut to crack as far as saying, well, if you have X large plants versus Y small plants. But we're definitely looking at the mitigation aspects regardless of what it falls into that scenario.
I think we should leave it open at this time.
Okay.
A little more
But,
research on it.
I think we need to bring something back and give your board a little bit more guidance, but we'll shelve that for a future discussion.
I think you're just missing the number on the plant count, otherwise.
Well, I think we need, from what I'm hearing from your board is maybe we'll look at what some other jurisdictions are specifically doing those, maybe provide you some ranges and come back for a number discussion
Yes.
on any commercial license types that are missing a plant count number, because that's the way the state did it, if I captured that correctly.
And I think the plant count outdoor is probably more critical than the plant count indoor. Indoor, you're going to do multiple harvests on an annual basis. Outdoor, you're going to get one good crop. And so it certainly has a larger effect on your outdoor grows, I would think. Help me some professionals.
Way to go, Dan.
See what I started? Okay, I'm not asking you guys anymore.
But we got the answer. Thank you.
So I heard canopy size for the audience, but I think that's just another discussion we'll have to take up of whether a plant count would be applicable for any
Yeah.
state permit that's actually missing that number as such, because that's how the state sized it.
One other thing I'd like to, I have in my things that should be done, is I don't think we need to have this rule that says plantings do not, right now they're all contiguous. And because of lots and setbacks, I don't think it's necessary that they have to be contiguous, as long as they meet the number and the plant and the setback. If you have two grow areas, because that's less damage to your property, then that should be allowed. I don't think they have to be contiguous.
That is the way the state looks at that, as long as you have all of your canopy defined on your site plan, as long as the sum total fits in the box, that is the way the state looks at it with their licensing.
They can be separate?
They can be separate, so you could have two defined areas that weren't touching, as long as they all are within your parcel and the sum total fits in the box. That works for the state regulations.
Okay, well, I think farther back on one of your deals it said contiguous, and that was our old interim ordinance that was contiguous.
Well, we were looking at the contiguous on the parcels, so
Okay.
that would be that. But I think for this one,
Plantings, I want to make sure that they
Yeah.
can go.
I think for commercial purposes, if you had the same scenario that we discussed on personal, you had two parcels, one had a residence on it, one was adjacent, as long as your sum total of your state operation license fit all within those two parcels and fit within the sum total of whatever parameters we established and whatever the parameters the state established, I think that could be something we could probably do. Any other questions on commercial cultivation before we jump over to supply chain?
Just jump.
All right, that is definitely some input, so we thank you for that. Before we talk about commercial supply chain, this is everything past cultivation. This is getting into kind of the everything else for the remaining types, license types. We have definitely heard from your board that cultivation, as we just went through that exercise, is definitely a feat in itself, and definitely was our predominant activity we have in the county right now. Kind of the same question, if I were to answer those where we're at right now, I would say medical, yes, adult use, wait and see. Would that be fair to match what we've had for our commercial discussion previously on cultivation? Oh, excuse me, I'm a little closer to the mic here. So again, we've talked about previous meetings about focusing on cultivation, as that is the prominent use in our county right now, and maybe that's where we focus our efforts. And then also mirroring from the discussion that we had on the commercial cultivation side, allow medical, yes, and adult use as a wait and see. Is that fair for those three questions that we've posed right there?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Supervisor Hall?
No, I'm a little confused on the discussion we just had. We talked about medical, and we talked about what you're calling medical commercial, and there's commercial, adult use. We're not talking about commercial.
I was still talking about commercial, but this was what I'm referring to as supply chain. This is everything past cultivation, everything that we talked about
Yeah.
previously just now. Medical, commercial, plants in the ground. This is everything that then comes back after that,
Right,
manufacturing,
I don't see
processing.
why we distinguish, and the supply chain needs to be there for anything that's grown.
That's the track and trace you're talking about, or how it's defined by the state, right?
Well, the state has its license types for what I'm just referring to as supply chain. They have their distinct one, but it's the whole seed to sale as you go through the whole process. But we have a lot of work to do on just the cultivation side of that, and so.
But you're asking about testing, manufacturing, et cetera, right?
Exactly.
So it's that vertical integration of different components of the cannabis industry.
Exactly, and I think doing this all in one shot might be a really tall order. It actually goes back to my elephant slide, one bite at a time. So asking the question, we could focus on the cultivation side of that to get those commercial side up and running, and then get that up and underway, and then focus on the supply chain then thereafter. I think the state regs are actually still evolving in that, so there's still some regulation that come out of that, but we could bring back just some cultivation regulations relatively quickly as opposed to taking on the whole part with supply chain. So maybe taking it in pieces versus part and actually get some of this done and on the books.
I guess I would say I understand the workload part of this, and, you guys have a lot to do. I get that, but, I've sort of been educated on the issue that once we're allowing cultivation, there's a lot of product, and it's stuck in this county, or it's going out and being packaged and being transported and being tested illegally. So I think we have to do it I think we have to allow for licensing for the supply chain kind of at the same time, I'm afraid to say. Otherwise, what are we doing with the product? We're putting them in a legal system to cultivate, but then there's no way.
But you want a cultivation ordinance by May 1st, and you start adding that into it, and it ain't going to happen.
Well, I could see us doing it in different chunks, but I'm not.
Well, yeah, well, let's do it in different
But
chunks.
I'm not advocating
cultivation,
waiting.
we're well on our way right now for cultivation.
But you've got 17, we've got 17 license types, and we're not going to, take a bite out of all of these in the time that we have right now. I can understand the cultivation, I can understand nursery, I can understand transportation and testing, but
Right.
when we're looking at, everything else, your manufacturing especially, that's something that we've got to just step back and take a real close look at. But there are some license types that obviously we do need to deal with. I don't think we need to deal with just distribution, but I do feel we need to deal with transportation and testing. We've got to get the product tested. It's got to be transported.
No, I think you need to deal with distribution because, as I understand it, the distribution license allows a distributor to go to the farm, pick up the batch, take it back to the lab, get it tested, then take the product from the farm to whatever he's going to distribute or she's going to distribute it to. So I think your transportation and distribution are almost.
I'm sorry, Hank, I agree with you.
Well, I think
I hate to say that, Hank, but I agree with you. Yeah, you're 11 and you're 11 and 12. Your Type 11 license can have a Type 12 also.
Well, I have.
Well, that's all I was advocating.
Which makes sense.
I have three.
You agree with me too, then?
No.
Yes, you do.
I think I have three. I think distribution and labeling, delivery service, and testing labs are all functions that are needed for the crop, the product, to get out of here.
But
Heidi's right. We got great cultivation, and it's all sitting there, and what do we do with it?
But here again, cultivation, we really need something by May 1st. You have more time on these other.
Well, you have until the crop is ready to be,
Well,
but they have to.
Well, we
they
can
gotta
start
know-
on it. We can start on it, but right now, we need to focus on cultivation, I think. And I don't disagree at all with with all of it. Even manufacturing, a legalized manufacturing business versus a residential house blowing up. We need to pursue all these.
So if the issue is, if we're all in tentative agreement on this, and the issue is workload, can we just figure out the workload so that you're getting started, somebody's doing the research for these licenses while you're actually developing the model ordinance for the cultivation piece of it? I mean, is there a way to split this up so we can start on it at least?
Background question, though. Are the cities looking at doing any of these at this point in time? Are they considering doing testing, distribution, et cetera?
Nevada City's actually already approved what they're going to do. I know Truckey's gone through their process. I don't think Grass Valley's actually.
Truckee has sort of said nothing, they have nothing regarding, as far as I know, regarding testing and such.
Testing and such, but they've all looked at their specific license types, and Truckee and Nevada City have allowed certain types that work for them, and I don't think Grass Valley's actually weighed in yet.
Yeah, Grass Valley's not going to.
Well, if these license types are
right now.
being allowed already in Nevada City, then is there a hurry for us to do it?
Well, you know, I've talked with, and you guys probably have too, people that are interested in distributing. It's not a big deal. I mean, you just have to put it in the proper zones, and in these cases, distribution probably isn't going to go in an ag zone. It's probably going to go in a commercial zone.
It's going to go in M1 or commercial.
Yeah, right.
The majority of the folks that I've talked to with the CAG process, one-on-one, meeting with the Alliance, definitely the predominant are in the cultivation side of it. There's definitely some interest in the other side of it, but I think this would be, the question for your board is the prioritization. Let's get a portion of it done, get a portion of it on the books, let people know where the rules are, and we still have all the other things to work on as well. So those other efforts and research and things that we bring forward wouldn't stop because of that.
And we're only looking at, still again, we're only looking at medical. We're not looking at adult use now. But the manufacturing portion is try and stop people from spraying Sour Patch Kids with tincture right now.
We're looking at commercial.
So, yeah, that's, I think the manufacturing, right, and we've got time.
You mean the bag with all the stuff in it?
The bag with all the stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Sean, honestly, I hear the workload issue, but I'm hearing relative agreement that we need to start moving on it as well, if we can figure out the workload issue.
Well, if we rank
right?
it as a priority A, B, and C, I would rank it as a priority C, because I think cultivation and zoning is something that's going to occupy their time right now.
Right, but I'm wondering if we could, I mean, we could borrow some of the other, look at what some of the other licenses that have been developed are at this time and sort of bring those forward so we could start educating ourselves on what they're.
Yeah, but as far as manufacturing, you know, we can step back and see what Nevada City does, how they handle it, how it's approached, and actually how safe and as effective it is.
Mr. Chairman?
You're right on manufacturing.
Mr. Chairman?
These three.
Yeah, hang on, Hank. Rick.
I would strongly recommend that the Board of Supervisors focus on cultivation, and let's get us a cultivation ordinance in place. I think the other items are very important, but I do believe staff is stretched. There's been some disappointment expressed by board members because certain things weren't done in time and I didn't get things in my packet. And I have to emphasize that we only have so much staff. We have not added staff. And this is taking on it's growing. And I would focus on the cultivation. I would agree in most instances, remember, Nevada County is primarily a rural county, right? We're in charge of the rural area. If the cities do the manufacturing, that's normally the way it goes. We do the cultivation, they do the manufacturing and the testing. That's what the cities are all about. I mean, they're set up for that kind of thing. But we can have this debate whether we're going to have testing and all of the other aspects of edibles and everything else, manufacturing, after we have a cultivation ordinance. People have waited a long time for the cultivation ordinance, and we need to get that done.
Thank you for your comment, Mr. Haffey.
And Supervisor Schofield, I'd also say when we focus on cultivation, some other jurisdictions might move a little farther along down in the supply chain process, and I have no problem stealing good ideas from other ordinances, from other jurisdictions that come up with some great ideas. So that might allow us to borrow from some other folks that get a little further down the line with that.
Well, again, we're pushed to come up with the cultivation ordinance. That's the priority, but we have to have these other things on our mind too.
I agree, and I would really appreciate if you could, that would be great to provide us some other things to start thinking about and working on.
So you're looking at the page that has supply chain. I think we can just forget looking at volatile manufacturing and, you know, the other things, and take Rick's recommendation and just, let's get the cultivation taken care of and get these people out of the room.
Well, that's what we're doing at this point. No,
Because I'm not asking you any more
we
questions.
don't get them out of the room.
And just to make sure I'm clear, I support Rick's recommendation also. I think that's words of wisdom.
All right, moving on.
All right, so I think that wraps us up on supply chain, and I think there's just some other comments that we can do. We're actually moving along with time really well. We're getting to the home stretch here for some things we need some comments on. It's kind of some other decision points, some things that we wanted to at least talk about conceptually, but maybe not drill down in the numbers. Again, heard a public comment. We talk about non-remuneration. Obviously, the translation is gifting to medical purposes, no transaction. If you're engaged with this with 5 patients or less, the state's completely out of it. That's definitely left for local jurisdictions to look at. So I think I already heard it brought up before that maybe we look at a certain type of permit with some parameters that allows that activity to go on. And I think I already had already heard positive comments on that. So I think that would be a yes.
Yes, and it would fall into the priority of cultivation this year.
Any other comments on that from the board? Okay, I think we can work with council to maybe come up with something to address that issue. Separate to that, more kind of coming back to a little bit of a hot topic one is a residence requirement. And that's going back to a previous comment we had on the personal cultivation, whether you require a permitted residence on or adjacent to it to allow cultivation activity. This does raise the question of, does that apply to commercial or not? We did establish that for personal, but now we are talking commercial. And we definitely want to say this is not to be confused with residency. Having a residence means a building there, residency, not where you live. That's got some legal challenges. I'm sure council could explain more on that. And then it does fall into a CAG recommendation where we did have it on both personal and commercial. So are we going to, the question before the board would be, are you going to allow folks to commercially cultivate on vacant property is really comes down to the question on this one.
No.
No.
How did you get from residency to vacant property and commercial? I'm lost, sorry.
Well, is that if you have the commercial operation on the property in those zones that we talked about with those setbacks, that somehow there is a residence, an improved parcel adjacent or associated with that commercial operation. So this is a little bit of the home-based business concept, being that you can't just have a vacant property out in the middle of nowhere and have a commercial cultivation on it, because for both enforcement sakes and stakeholder and having a little bit of skin in the game, those are a lot of the comments that we hear on that as far as just allowing just absolute vacant land to be commercially cultivated.
And so I would agree with the CAG recommendation on that. And then the residency requirement, you were suggesting you don't want comments on that?
I'd actually defer that one to council. There's some legal challenges out there with residency right now, being that the translation of that, you're a Nevada County resident, it's somebody from outlying the area.
Right.
Just to clarify that, there's no issue with requiring someone, as we do in our current ordinance, to live on the property and be responsible for the grow. So it does have to be your residence to grow. And it's a way of making sure that the grow is under the control and supervision of someone who is legally entitled to have that grow. It's the residency issue has to do with suggestions that we require that somebody was a resident of this county for a certain period of time before they are eligible for a license. That is the legal concern, and that potentially violates both the Dormant Commerce Clause and the Equal Protection Clause.
Well, there are other counties who do have them. So are those counties facing legal challenges at this time?
The only county that actually has one, because I have checked with all of my colleagues, is Trinity County, and I'm not sure that their regulations were reviewed by legal before they were adopted.
But we can talk about priority processing or proof of prior cultivation.
that raises similar issues. We are looking at that, looking for ways, we
Okay.
understand the issue and concern, and we share in that
Okay.
concern, and we have had conversations with the Alliance, and we'll continue to look at that.
Great, thank you.
So to go back to those two questions, I heard yes on the improvement on the parcel, that is a residence, and then no on the residency being what council just educated us on.
I wouldn't say no, I'd say it's open question at this point, that we do need some kind of an ability to make sure that our local folks get first priority for.
So maybe a question mark on
Yeah,
priority
if you could.
processing?
Yeah, thanks.
But there's no issue as far as requiring a resident on the property, is that? Right. Okay. I mean, that's a safety issue.
Yes, I think I got clear direction on that, Supervisor Miller.
And Sean, I think Sonoma County has expedient or preference in processing for licenses for residents, for residency rather than people coming into the area.
Yeah, a few other counties have had some language on that. We could see maybe if there's something we could borrow from or that's working.
So they go to the head of the list. Put them at the top of the list, and the other ones go to the bottom of the list.
Well, we could look at maybe.
We can keep changing the list.
Yeah, we'll take a look at that. Definitely another hot topic for discussion is an issue of a transition period. We want to be clear actually what this would apply to based on the CAG recommendation. I think there's been confusion on this issue, being that on the land use, zoning, and building code violations, I've definitely talked to a lot of growers as far as, yeah, I've got all this stuff unpermitted. I'd like to get it unpermitted. We did host a compliance workshop that was heavily attended by growers on the, how do we go through the as-built process? How do I get my greenhouse permit and such? So there's definitely an interest in getting those in, but that process does take time. So there was discussion at the CAG meetings as far as, would you allow some time for those folks to get the land use issues into compliance? And specifically, this would not apply to the cannabis rules. Right off the bat, whatever the rules are, your cannabis operation has to fit within the cumulative total box of the cannabis operations. But let's say they have an unpermitted greenhouse, that as long as they come in and start that process at some point, that we would allow some time for them to get the land use issues into compliant while allowing them to still cultivate. So I throw that issue back to your board if that's something we want to include in the next round of the ordinance.
So the procedure now is that we work with the landowner to get them in compliance. What is the time limit the building department and you allow?
Well, the really issue comes up with that if we were going to engage in either a local sign-off or a local permit to engage in medical commercial cultivation. If they come in and they have a violation on their property, how much time would we give them to get that corrected and then still allow them? So we had a lot of dates that got thrown out between no time all the way up to 5 years. I think the CAG settled on March 2020. That was a date that got kind of thrown around, but it does take some time to process that. This would be unique to cannabis. Most of our land use regulations do not have that. I mean, we allow folks some time. If you come in to pull a permit and we see some things that are not permitted on your property, we'll tell you to get those other things permitted, but we're not going to file either one of the projects till you get the process complete. But as far as letting you proceed on one completely with violations on another, this would be unique to cannabis.
Well, I mean, if there's a procedure and a process now for me to come in because my house had nothing to do with cannabis, my house was non-permitted, how am I allowed, and how much time am I allowed to get it done? What is that procedure now?
We already have the as-built process in place, and we have definitely been recommending that to growers and non-growers alike, that if you want to go through an as-built process because you have that, it applies to the regular permitting standards. So typically you'd have 2 years to complete that process.
Okay,
but you've come in, you paid your fees, you started the process, you've drawn up your plans, you're requiring inspections, and that process itself takes time, but you're in the fold as far as coming in and starting the process by pulling your permit.
So I think that same procedure would be applied here. They can go ahead and grow their commercial crop, and they've got the 2 years or whatever to get themselves into compliance, whatever we do with just anybody else who walks in and needs an as-built.
But if I'm hearing you right, then Supervisor Weston, they would actually have to apply for the
Oh, yes.
permits before we'd issue them. That would be commercial authorization.
They'd have to start the process. It's two tacks. They're growing over here, they're meeting your standard, whatever comes for cultivation, but they're also working on getting their building up to standard.
So if they're trying to get their residents up to standards, normally you wouldn't allow someone to inhabit that building until it's been finalized. Is that correct?
Correct. We need to issue the certificate of occupancy to make sure that that building's habitable because it's gone through the full
So are you
permit
saying
and
that
inspection
during this
process.
transition period, they're going to be able to inhabit and receive a conditional occupancy permit?
Well, I think there's a large, well, I wouldn't say a large number. There's probably, there are unpermitted structures out there right now that people are inhabiting.
See, this is where we're getting pushback from the business community here is why should this be unique to cannabis when it wasn't unique or allowed for us when we started our businesses? And this is where I'm having a little angst as far as a transition period. And there are people out there who are doing it right now, but are not going to grow until they have everything in place so that when they do grow, they know that there's not going to be anything that they haven't already completed that is permitted. And they're having a hard time saying, oh yeah, but I don't mind if they do it. I'm doing it right, but I do have a problem with someone else getting special dispensation on this. And so this transition period is a little sticky item politically that, you've got those businesses that, well, why? Why do they get special privileges? And so I'm having a difficult time unless you can convince me that we should do it.
I think it really comes down to a policy decision. You've had a highly unregulated market that you're trying to get into regulation. Definitely if they've come in and do applied, that's a higher criteria level compared to saying, well, if you apply next year, that's okay, versus letting them proceed, but it's definitely a policy decision.
But on the other hand, they know that they've got unpermitted buildings that they're using. And they know it's unlawful, but until their feet are held to the fire, they're not going to do anything.
We encourage everybody to get permits on their property that are unpermitted, regardless if they're engaging in cannabis activity or not.
Yeah, if I could just echo that we're trying to bring people into the regulated market, and of course they may have buildings that aren't up to code. What they're doing doesn't have a regulation for them to be following, and so they're not going to be inviting people out there to I mean, I think what you're suggesting, and frankly, we've been getting information about a lot of out-of-compliance businesses that we're giving a lot of time to come into code for. So I'm looking for consistency, and I'm seeing this as being consistent.
Well, and I think, again, if a person is willing to go through the licensing procedure, not only of ours, but through the state of California, those people are going to do what they need to do to make the whole system work. I don't think this is a fly-by-night operation.
Yeah,
this
well,
is going to cost a lot of money to get started.
And I wouldn't disagree with some type of transition period, but I think 2 years is too long.
Here again,
I'm understanding that that's what we give other folks, 2 years. Is that right?
As long as your permit's in good standing and you're making progress, you
Yeah.
can't go up to 2 years with that.
Yeah, the key word is as long as you're making progress.
Well, they would not be, without a permit in process, they would not be granted a local permit for growing until they had that in place.
That's potentially one place to draw the line as far as if you applied and you've submitted definitely something of substance, that being that you've made an honest effort to comply and given us a package for far as an as-built process or not. That would be a criteria we could be applied to before we'd issue a permit or a local authorization. That could be a criteria we could apply.
So there's going to be a fee attached to that application?
Is for the as-built process or for the cannabis permit?
Both.
Both.
It would be both.
So, Sean, if a person is currently living in well, let's say they're permitted, are you going to inspect that facility before you allow them to grow?
Are you saying if, let's say, somebody's got a house on a property?
Yes.
And they submit their application through our process for our local permit, if at least everything on the site plan appears to be permitted, we'd only be focusing on things related to the cannabis.
Okay.
But if we go out there and let's say there's an accessory structure that's not permitted,
Okay.
we'd look at the site plan,
Sure.
go out there upon inspection and say, no, that's something else you'd have to get corrected and get through the as-built process. But if it's not directly related to the operation and it is permitted, we're not going to take a closer look at that.
Okay, good. 2 years.
Okay?
Okay.
So I'm hearing that basically before we would issue any local authorization or local permit for cultivation, that they would have at least applied for their permit before we'd go ahead and issue that.
And they would have to show progress
Yeah.
in that 2-year time.
Okay, getting down to the home stretch here, definitely going back to Supervisor's Miller comment. Kind of redefine this. One is the use setback. This is the one that we'd like to talk about with schools and everything else like that. This does kind of mirror what the state came up with the 600 number. This does jive a little bit with what the CAG recommended. You'll hear some confusion about 600 feet or 1,000 feet. To clarify, the state regulations specify 1,000 feet for consumption of cannabis products, whereas 600 feet back from property line for licensed facilities. So that's where we came up with the 600. You'll see that we applied a couple of designations for this between the schools, the parks, childcare. This mirrors the state designation. We did not get creative in the CAG process and add in these to this. And it would be noted, lively discussions during the CAG meetings, bus stops is not included in this question. So with that, I would ask the board if they agree with that use setback parameter.
Does it include churches and other, public gathering places? It just seems the old one had their schools on churches or religious deal, so.
It includes child care centers, which would include churches with child care centers.
And schools?
I would think.
And also youth-oriented facility would be a church, I would think, because they have
Active school, park, childcare.
Are we talking commercial or commercial and personal?
The way the state defines the regulation, this would apply to commercial only, but you could apply it to personal if you chose to. But I think the real intent was to apply it to commercial.
Well, I would hope that what we've laid out here wouldn't have any too close to a school or a daycare center.
This is the additional setback requirement for mitigation for impacts on youth is the way most of the discussions have gone. And depending on the parameters of a parcel that is cultivating the surrounding parcels, whether there would be something adjacent to it. I mean, you can find parcels out there that are adjacent to school sites. So it does provide that additional buffer if the board chose.
That almost would require a use permit, I think. If you're around a school, you're in the middle of the neighborhood, even if it's Forest Lake Christian School.
We could look at the commercial activity through a use permit, but in looking at that use permit, we'd have to see what requirements apply to that, and this would be another layer of the use permit review if this was part of the cannabis cultivation ordinance.
Well, if we wouldn't require a use permit, I'd rather shove that up to 1,000 feet rather than the 600 around, especially around parks where a lot of youth are and active schools and child care centers. There has to be some protection for those kids, and I'd rather see the 1,000 foot. Your commercial activities are going to be out there far, and so anything else close in town is basically going to be illegal. So you might as well throw something else in there on top of them in order to locate them. So I'd rather see the 1,000 rather than the 600.
I would say 1,000 too.
So would I.
We add to it, I wouldn't want to see them anywhere near a school, really, or a church.
comments? I have two 1,000-foot considerations. Three, okay. Hearing at least three, I think we would look at that from a 1,000-foot setback. And as far as at least the way we framed up the definitions of those, at least is that a good starting point for what we've identified that would apply to?
Mr. Chair, if I may, one option we could do in bringing this back to you is give you a comparison between the existing setback requirements and what's being proposed here based on state law, and then you could make a decision at that point. You would see a red line, if that would be helpful to the board.
It would be helpful. Is that it?
But I think the direction we got on this, definitely we want to have a use setback in there around 1,000 square feet with some definitions that would apply. So I think that gives us the direction that we need.
Linear feet, not square feet.
What'd I say?
Square feet.
I said square feet, yeah, 1,000 linear feet, thank you. Been up this for a while. So with that, we're getting to the good stuff is we've got everything that we think that I came up with. So as far as other decision points, this is the board's opportunity to add any items that we think we missed.
I have a couple. Do you?
I just want to make sure, I think I want clarification on the local authorization that we did agree to move ahead on that, right?
That's definitely when we hear it. Definitely we wanted to have the conversation of commercial first, because if we're going to allow certain types of commercial and certain not, as far as temporaries go, that tells us where we'd have to focus our efforts. I did hear from the board that temporary is something that we want to look at.
Okay.
We do have some ideas for that,
Okay.
so
Thank you.
we'll take a look at that and see how we can factor that in. Now that we know policy direction, where we're going to focus our efforts by what commercial activities.
Okay, Hank?
Well, I just have on my list, I have groundwater issues, and it's come from my district very strongly about, because we're in fractured rock basins. I know there's no groundwater controls, but it would seem to me that we need to be very careful how many straws we put in the ground. And I don't know how we work that into our ordinance, because we locally control the groundwater. The state hasn't taken it over yet. They're going to, but they haven't taken it over yet. So in the meantime, I think we should be very judicious on there's existing wells, how many, I mean, I see some problems when you have to start irrigating and you have to start sinking new wells.
Well, definitely as part of our permitting and local sign-off, verified water source, you've got a permitted well through EH, you're getting ditch water from NID, those are going to be how you're irrigating is definitely going to be a factor. And then we've had numerous discussions with council as far as what you could do to help mitigate those, either through study or limiting the number of wells or some things like that. So we have some ideas that we could probably bring back to your board addressing that issue.
Okay. The next one I have is a tax measure for November. I've seen all kinds. I've read all the different counties that have done different things, but we have a regulation cost, which is your operation or what it takes to regulate. But then we have a whole lot of other stuff out there that is affected by this industry that we're going to have to put a tax or at least address it.
With today's conversation, I think that allows us to really start looking at that closely. The fact that we are looking to engage in at least commercial medical cultivation, as far as any taxation to generate revenue for enforcement and things like that. Now that we know that's the direction we're going, we can definitely take a look at that.
Okay, and then the other one I have is I would recommend. I don't know how you want to approach it. We listen to Blue Ribbon commissions, this and that. I don't think we need to do that, but I would definitely enroll some technical advisors to run some of your language through before we see it, to see where it gives heartburn, if it's not understandable to the growers and all the folks involved, it's certainly not going to be understandable to us. So I would run some of those items through. You select, you know, I mean, we're not going to tell you who to select, but you've been in the CAG process. You know who you would bring in 2 or 3 people, somebody from ag, somebody from the industry, and run these things by them.
I've talked to a lot of people.
Yeah.
We could definitely accommodate that.
And then my last one is there's going to be those who are going to play by the rules and those who are not. And those who are not there needs to be a very strong fine and penalty system.
And that we know it can be enforced.
That will, yeah. You guys on the budget subcommittee are going to have to deal with that, baby.
All right, thank you, Supervisor Weston. I have all those points down. Richard?
Thank you, Chair Schofield. Just one point, and it's East County only. You know, I've been fighting to protect surface waters almost my entire adult life. I'm very concerned about the interaction between groundwater extraction and surface waters in the Martis Valley basin area, groundwater basin area, which is a priority 2 watershed or groundwater basin under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, SGMA. I would, you know, there's already interest in Truckee residents to move their grows out of Truckee and into the unincorporated area. I think that it's something which I'm worried about, and I think that we need to include that in any CEQA analysis that we do, and perhaps even consider a moratorium on grows in the unincorporated area within the Martis Valley groundwater basin and the recharge area prior to allowing those that use, the cultivation use within those zones. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think we need additional analysis to make sure that we're not that what we approve will not overly stress what I see as already a stressed groundwater basin and stressed surface waters, especially during drought period.
I think Supervisor Enshine, I got that point.
One comment I want to make, I also actually want to respond to Rick Caffey's rather sharp comment. My issue with the getting the late PowerPoint and with some of the other issues that came up was not about workload, and I appreciate all the work you've done, and some of you folks know I've had internal conversations about this. It was, I believe, about conflicting direction, about where we're going and what we're doing. So to that end, I want to just iterate that I think if we're getting conflicts between what staff wants to do or what county council thinks we need to do or what the CEO's office thinks we need to do, that it come back to us so there are no surprises. And I'd had ongoing conversations about what I was expecting to see here, and that got changed at the last minute. So I want to thank you for your hard work. This is a lot of hard work, and these are difficult issues. But if there's conflicts happening, please bring them back to us so we know where to go.
And the other thing, I go back to workload again. Do you have any feel for what your staff is going to be able to accomplish as you go through this process?
My intent is just to work with council closely, see what we can get done as far as cultivation, and just get through it as fast as possible. We can't do it all at once. I think it's too much of a complex issue, but I think as we actually start getting things moved into the ordinance side and establishing rules, maybe a couple bites at a time, I think once we're into that process, that'll really help with the workload right now, where we're at right now. We went through a very exhaustive public input process that was very good. Now we're moving to transition over that. I want to see those efforts start coming into ordinance language and getting adopted, and I think that's where we'll feel like we're making progress. So.
And as you get to that point, you're going to have to formulate or create some type of a fee schedule.
Correct. We'll look at what the process is. We had a very robust conversation as far as permitting goes. The 3-touch process is like it is. It went over very well with the CAG. we're in the permitting business. We already have an idea of what we want to do. So I don't think that part of the process is going to be very tough to frame up, and it's already been vetted through the CAG process.
Yeah, the local air quality organization did raise the question, and Hank touched on it, is diesel generators. They've got real heartache over that, and it's something that really we never really have discussed, but it's something that is foremost on their mind.
Sure. We see part of the permitting process is some routing to our fellow jurisdictions depending on what activity it is, and that's things we'll definitely be looking at.
Okay. Thanks, Doug.
Generators are banned under state law. Are we,
All right. Any other additions from the board?
well,
Okay.
I kind of hate to say this, but first of all, I want to say I can't thank you guys enough for sitting through this and allowing us to do what we've done. I think we've really accomplished a lot. What I want to ask you, Sean, I know that there's things that we've said and done and people don't agree with what we've come up with. Could it be, and I asked my colleagues this too, that we take a day like March 6th that we were looking at, bring it back here just primarily for public comment?
I'm open to the board's direction. I've definitely got farther into the presentation than I expected given the content matter. We definitely got enough direction to at least start the process with council to start drafting those things. If your board was open to receiving more comment on this, I'd defer to your board on that.
You guys glaring at me, or?
No.
Would you be open to that? I think it's just a way of saying thank you so much, you guys. It's truly appreciated.
Supervisor, if I could maybe add to maybe a deliverable on that from staff, I think we'll try to digest a lot of the board's comments and maybe put it into sort of an executive summary. We talked about a lot of things in a lot of detail, and just make sure that everybody's on the same sheet of music for everything that I've written down, and I know Molly was too, making sure that we've captured everything accurately.
All right.
Place it on the cannabis conversation site on our webpage. That'd be useful.
Yes. Everything that we do in the meetings automatically gets put up on the website, and that just keeps building as far as every time we do something, present something, make a milestone, that all gets memorialized on there.
So the meeting on the 6th would be primarily to listen to the public. And I think that we would be just that much further ahead to when the actual ordinance is brought back to us. And it gives us time to think about some of the actions that we took today, although we didn't take any actions.
No, we just gave direction.
That's right. Sean, thank you for your help.
Oh, thank you, Supervisor.
Brian, Molly, thank you.
If I may say one thing, you've been at this now for 7 years, many people, and I want to thank everybody here for getting us to this point. We've been working for 7 years to get here. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Brad. Is there any other business of the board? Seeing none? This meeting is adjourned. Thank you again. All right, folks, I've told we have another meeting coming in here following this one, so we need to start setting up for that. So if you will, try to carry your conversations on out into the lobby.